They called security on him in front of 500 people, dragged him out of the most important night in the company's history like he was a criminal, like he was nothing. He didn't fight back, didn't raise his voice, just looked at the woman pointing her finger at him and said quietly, "You're going to need me back." Nobody laughed louder than the executives in that room. Nobody. But here's what none of them knew. Not the CEO, not the board, not a single investor in that glittering ballroom. The quiet man they just threw out the door? He owned 60% of the company they were all standing in. Before we go any further, if stories about justice, betrayal, and ordinary people who turn out to be anything but ordinary speak to you, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. This channel is where those stories live. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. And if you're still with me at the end, don't forget to hit that like button. It costs you nothing and means everything to a small channel. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The parking lot at Novaris Technologies had a hierarchy, and everyone who worked there understood it without needing to be told. The executives got covered spots near the east entrance, climate-controlled in summer, sheltered from the sleet in winter. Senior engineers were one row back, managers after that. And at the far end of the lot, past the decorative hedges that nobody ever trimmed properly, a collection of older vehicles sat in the exposed sun or rain, depending on the season. Mason Brooks parked his '09 Ford F-150 in that far corner every single morning. The truck had over 200,000 miles on it. The passenger side mirror had been knocked off in a grocery store parking lot 3 years ago and replaced with an aftermarket piece that never quite matched the original color. There was a crack in the dashboard that Mason had filled with a strip of black electrical tape, which Evan had decorated with a row of small star stickers the previous autumn. Mason had left the stars there. He locked the truck at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning in March, slung his laptop bag over one shoulder, and walked across the lot toward the building. He was wearing what he wore almost every day: dark work pants, a faded flannel shirt in blue and gray, and steel-toed boots that had long since lost any meaningful shine. His ID badge hung from a lanyard that Evan had made at a school craft fair, a woven purple and green thing that drew the occasional sideways glance in the hallways of Novaris. He didn't mind. He was 32 years old, which surprised people when they eventually learned it, because Mason Brooks had the kind of face that looked like it had been thinking seriously about things for a long time. Not old, just settled. Dark eyes that stayed calm when other people's didn't. A jaw that needed a shave about 2 days before he ever remembered to deal with it. He moved unhurriedly in a building full of people who were always performing urgency, and that stillness tended to make him invisible in exactly the way he had designed. The lobby was already busy. 2 men in expensive suits were arguing quietly near the coffee station, their voices professional and tight. A cluster of junior analysts moved through the turnstiles with their phones up, heads down. The receptionist, a young woman named Dana, who was genuinely kind and one of the few people in the building who greeted Mason by name, waved from across the lobby. "Morning, Mr. Brooks. You see the memo about the gala? They redid the seating chart. Apparently the investor tables got rearranged again." "Morning, Dana," Mason said. "Haven't checked my email yet." "It's going to be beautiful. They rented real chandeliers. Did you know that? Like actual crystal ones from somewhere in Europe." She said it with the genuine enthusiasm of someone who still found those things remarkable, and Mason liked that about her. "I'll stick to the back corner," he said. She laughed like she thought he was joking. He wasn't. What? Mason's official title at Novaris Technologies was Senior IT Infrastructure Contractor. On paper, that meant he maintained server architecture, managed system security protocols, and handled the technical scaffolding that kept the company's software products running. In practice, it meant that when something broke, truly broke, the kind of break that made vice presidents go pale and start making hushed phone calls, Mason was the person someone eventually called. Not first. Never first. First came the internal team leads, then the senior engineers, then the department heads, then a frantic search through the contractor directory, and then finally, usually around hour 4 of the crisis, someone would say, "Has anyone called Brooks?" And Mason would come. And he would fix it, and then he would go back to his corner of the building and continue being invisible. He had an office, technically, a narrow room at the end of the 3rd-floor IT corridor, with a window that faced the HVAC equipment on the adjacent rooftop. He'd set a small framed photo of Evan on the desk in his first week and hadn't changed much else since. There was a whiteboard covered in architecture diagrams so dense and specific that the one time a VP had wandered in and looked at it, the man had gone quiet for a long moment and then left without saying anything. Mason liked the office for its quiet. He liked it for the fact that almost nobody came to find him there unless they needed something. That morning, he sat down with a black coffee from the lobby machine. Not the good stuff the executives had upstairs, just the standard lobby brew that tasted like ambition without follow-through. And he opened his system's dashboard. The company's anniversary gala was 72 hours away. The numbers on his screen told him something that no one else in the building had noticed yet. He set his coffee down slowly and stared. The gala had been months in planning. Novaris Technologies was turning 15 years old, and 15 years in the tech industry was, depending on who you asked, either an achievement worth celebrating or a miracle worth marking. The company had survived 2 market crashes, 1 catastrophic product failure, and a leadership transition that had nearly split the board in half. It had come out the other side leaner, more focused, and, in the past 3 years, genuinely successful. Much of that success was attributable to the woman who now ran it. Olivia Carter was 30 years old, the youngest CEO in the company's history, and she had not gotten there by being patient with mediocrity. She had degrees from schools that had waiting lists for their waiting lists. She wore suits that looked simple and cost more than Mason's truck. Her hair was dark and always precisely arranged in a way that suggested she had been awake since 4 in the morning, but had managed that time efficiently. She moved through the Novaris offices like someone who had already decided every outcome was acceptable as long as it was optimized. She was not cruel. Mason had observed her carefully for 3 years, and he understood the distinction. She was demanding and occasionally dismissive and frequently wrong in ways that her confidence prevented her from recognizing, but she wasn't mean in the way some leaders were mean. She believed in the company. She worked for it genuinely. She had also never once spoken to Mason directly. He had been in rooms with her 17 times. He knew because he kept rough counts of things like that, a habit from years of building systems where tracking inputs mattered. 17 times. And she had looked through him the way people look through furniture. Not unkindly. Just, he wasn't there, in the way the lobby coffee machine wasn't there. Functional background. Which was, of course, exactly what he'd intended. 3 years ago, when Mason had restructured his involvement with Novaris, from active founder to silent background contractor, he'd made the deliberate choice to let the institution grow around him like a tree growing around a fence post. The company needed to develop leadership that wasn't dependent on him. He needed to know if it could. What he'd found was complicated. Olivia was genuinely gifted in ways that mattered: strategy, communication, the ability to read a market. The leadership team she'd inherited was a different story. And Victor Langley, the chief operating officer who had championed her appointment and positioned himself as her most trusted advisor, was a story Mason had been reading very carefully for a long time now. He looked at his screen. The authentication logs from the company's core encryption system, the deep architecture that protected the most sensitive layer of Novaris's intellectual property, showed access patterns that didn't match any maintenance schedule. Small things. The kind of anomalies that only looked meaningful in aggregate, only visible if you knew exactly what the baseline looked like. Mason knew what the baseline looked like because he'd written it. He pulled up a secondary window and began cross-referencing timestamps. He was still doing that at noon when he forgot to eat lunch. He was still doing it at 3:15 when his phone buzzed with a text from Evan's school saying that Evan had won the class spelling bee and wanted his dad to know. Mason stopped what he was doing, smiled at the phone, and typed back, "That's my guy. Pizza tonight." Then he went back to the logs. By 4:30, he had enough to know that something was happening inside Novaris's systems. Not enough to know exactly who or exactly what, but enough to know it needed attention before the gala, before the major acquisition deal that was being finalized in parallel, before any of the things that were about to happen to this company happened. He saved his findings to an encrypted external drive. Then he saved them again to an off-site location he'd maintained privately since the day he'd first stepped back from Novaris. Then he flagged a concern ticket in the internal system, marked it medium priority because flagging it high would draw the wrong attention from the wrong people while he still didn't know who was involved. He would follow up in the morning. He shut down his workstation, slung on his bag,
and drove home to celebrate Evan's spelling bee victory with a large pepperoni pizza and a game of cards that Mason let go 2 rounds longer than it needed to before Evan finally noticed his dad was doing it on purpose and called him out with absolute outrage. "You let me win again, Dad. I can tell." "You won fair and square." "Dad, you spelled necessary correctly. I don't even know how you learned that one." "Because you made me write it 10 times because I spelled it wrong on my homework. And look how that worked out." Evan threw a card at him. Mason caught it. They laughed. It was for a few hours a completely ordinary evening in a quiet apartment on a street that nobody powerful would ever have reason to visit.
And Mason sat across the small table from his 8-year-old son and was genuinely, uncomplicated happy, the way you could only be happy when you'd learned to stop needing it from big rooms full of important people. He had no idea that in less than 72 hours, one of those big rooms would change everything. The gala was held in the Meridian Grand Ballroom, a venue on the 14th floor of the city's convention center that event planners called iconic and that Mason would have called a lot of chandeliers. Dana had been right about those. They were real crystal, imported, and they caught the light in ways that made $500 glasses of wine look like they were worth the price. The room had been dressed in the company's navy and silver branding, tastefully done. Long tables arranged in curved rows around a central stage. A string quartet playing something European and dignified near the entrance. Photographers from 3 different outlets moving through the crowd like sharks in formal wear. Mason arrived in his truck, parked in the event overflow lot 3 blocks away, and walked to the entrance in a sport coat he'd bought for Evan's school recital 2 years ago. It still fit. He'd combed his hair. He had not been planning to attend. He'd planned to spend the evening reviewing the anomalous access logs he'd flagged the day before, which had escalated overnight in ways that made his stomach tighten. But the gala was technically a company-wide event. Attendance was logged, and Mason had reasons, careful, specific reasons, to want to be present and visible while he continued tracking the situation quietly. So he walked into the Meridian Grand with his recital sport coat and Evan's purple and green lanyard, and found himself a seat at one of the contractor tables in the back third of the room, equidistant from the bar and the emergency exit, and he sat and watched. The room was full of exactly the kind of electricity that powerful events generate. Investors he recognized from quarterly briefings he'd read but never attended, executives from partner companies, journalists who covered enterprise technology with the specific intensity of people who'd once imagined covering war zones. Novaris's entire senior leadership was present, Olivia at the center of it, working the room with a precision that Mason genuinely admired, because social precision was not a gift he'd ever cultivated in himself. Victor Langley was at her side for most of the early evening. Mason watched Victor. Victor was 51, silver-haired, and possessed of the very specific confidence of a man who had spent decades in rooms where his confidence was sufficient to substitute for other things. He had a laugh that filled whatever space it occupied. He wore a watch that a journalist had once written about in a profile that Mason had read 3 times, taking careful notes on what the man chose to put in front of a camera and what he kept back. Victor laughed at something now, something an investor said, and put his hand on Olivia's arm briefly in the manner of someone making sure the most important person in the room was associated with him. Mason looked away and checked his phone. The encrypted monitoring alert he'd set up the previous afternoon had triggered. The logs he'd flagged had been accessed, not by the security team he'd hoped would respond, but by someone with a senior system credential. Someone who had looked at exactly what Mason had found and then cleared the flag from the internal queue. Mason sat with that information for a long moment. His hands were steady. The string quartet was playing something that he didn't know the name of, but that Evan would have liked. Something with a cello part that moved underneath everything else, doing all the structural work while the violins got the attention. I was reaching for his phone to send one message, one careful, specific message to a contact outside the company, when the evening fell apart. The speeches began at 8. Olivia was good at this. She was better at it than Mason had expected when she'd taken the role 3 years ago, and he'd revised his assessment accordingly. She understood that a room like this one didn't want to be lectured or impressed. It wanted to be included. She spoke about the company the way you talked about a place where real work happened and real people showed up every day. And the room responded to that, leaned toward it slightly, the way an audience does when they stop expecting to be performed at and start feeling spoken to. She talked about the 15 years, about the market crash of year 4 that almost ended everything, about the product failure of year 8 that had taught the company more than its 5 best years combined. She was gracious about her predecessor. She was honest about her own learning curve. And then she pivoted to the acquisition. The pending deal, a $7 billion arrangement with Meridian Capital Group that would position Novaris as the dominant player in enterprise data security for the next decade, had been announced in broad strokes to the public, but the details were still under embargo. In the room tonight were the people who knew those details, and Olivia told them what the next 12 months would look like. And the room's energy shifted from warm to electric. Mason watched people's faces change, watched the mental math happen in real time, what this would mean for equity, for positions, for futures. He was still watching when Victor Langley stepped away from his table and approached a woman Mason didn't recognize. Young, dark suit, the particular quality of stillness that Mason associated with people who were trying not to be noticed. Victor leaned down and said something to her. She nodded once, sharply. Mason watched her take out her phone. 3 minutes later, Victor approached the stage, where he stood with the patient expression of a man about to do something he had practiced. He didn't interrupt. He waited until Olivia had finished a sentence, and then he took a step forward and said, quietly, but into a microphone that caught every word, "I'm sorry to interrupt. This is urgent." Olivia turned. "Victor? I need you to know what we found tonight." Victor's voice was controlled, serious, the register of a man delivering difficult news with appropriate gravity. "Our security team has identified an unauthorized system access event. Someone has been in our core architecture, in the encrypted layer that protects the acquisition infrastructure." The room, which had been electric seconds ago, went to a different kind of still. "When?" Olivia's voice was CEO voice, measured, careful. "The access occurred over the past 48 hours. Our team traced the credential." Victor paused. He was good at pauses. "The access was tied to a contractor badge." Mason felt something shift in him. Not panic, not surprise. A kind of resigned recognition, like hearing a piece of music resolve in a direction you'd expected but hoped against. "We've been able to identify the individual." Victor looked across the room with the practiced certainty of a man who had already decided this. Mason Brooks. 500 pairs of eyes found him. Mason sat very still. The thing about having spent years being invisible was that you developed a relationship with being seen. Most people, when suddenly looked at by a crowd, felt their heart rate spike, felt heat in their face, felt the biological pull to explain themselves. Mason felt his pulse stay level and his hands stay quiet in his lap, and he looked back at the room, at Olivia's face specifically, with the expression of a man who had known this moment was coming and had decided in advance how to inhabit it. "That's not accurate," Mason said. He said it at a normal speaking volume, which in the silenced room was somehow more startling than if he'd shouted. Victor looked at him. "Mr. Brooks, the access logs you're referencing were generated by my credential, but I didn't generate them." Mason stood up. He was not tall, not physically impressive, did not have the weight of Victor's kind of presence. He looked like what he looked like, a man in an older sport coat with a craft fair lanyard and 2 days of stubble. "Someone used a copy of my access credential. If you look at the actual metadata, security." Olivia's voice cut across the room. Not loud, not angry, exactly, but certain. The voice of someone who had made a decision and was executing it. "Please escort Mr. Brooks from the venue." "Ms. Carter." Mason stayed where he was. 5 minutes. Give me 5 minutes to show you the metadata on those logs." "Mr. Brooks." Olivia looked at him with an expression that was not cruel but was entirely final. "We'll address this formally. Tonight is not the place." 2 security guards, their expressions professionally blank, appeared at Mason's side. One of them put a hand on his arm, and it was a careful hand, not rough, and Mason looked at it for a moment before he looked back across the room at Olivia. "You're going to need me back," he said, "before the audit window closes." She said nothing. He let them walk him out. The walk from the Meridian Grand's 14th floor ballroom to the street-level exit was 4 minutes if you moved at a normal pace. Mason moved at a normal pace. The 2 security guards flanked him with the careful professionalism of people doing a job they didn't entirely feel good about, And Mason didn't give them any reason to feel worse about it. The lobby of the convention center was nearly empty. A few catering staff, a woman at the coat check reading something on her phone who looked up briefly and then looked back down. Nobody who mattered and nobody who watched. At the glass doors, one of the guards, a man about Mason's age with a crew cut and a Novaris security badge that read Torres, stopped. "Mr. Brooks," Torres said. His voice was lower than it had been upstairs, with the particular quality of someone speaking outside their professional function. "For what it's worth, I don't know what happened up there." "You did your job," Mason said. "That's fine." Torres nodded once, uncomfortably, and held the door. The March air outside was cold and smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet. Mason stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed it in. From 3 blocks away, his truck sat in the overflow lot exactly where he'd left it. The star stickers on the dashboard not visible from this distance, but present in his mind the way small, reliable things tended to be. He took out his phone. The monitoring alert from inside the gala, the one he'd been about to act on when Victor derailed the evening, was still there on his screen. He read it twice, carefully, the cold air moving around him and the distant sound of the city doing what cities do at 9:30 on a Tuesday night. He called the one number he needed to call. It rang twice. "It happened," Mason said when the line connected. "Faster than I expected. I need you to activate the secondary archive protocol tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight." A pause on the other end. Then, "You sure?" "I've been sure for 8 months," Mason said. "I was just hoping to be wrong." He hung up. He put his phone in his coat pocket. He walked 3 blocks to his truck, got in, and sat for a moment in the quiet dark of the cab with the star stickers on the dashboard, an Evans spelling bee trophy that had migrated from the apartment to the glove compartment for reasons Mason had never fully investigated. He started the engine. He had an 8-year-old son asleep at home with a babysitter he trusted, a building full of people who thought they'd solved a problem by throwing him out, and a company whose systems were actively being compromised by someone who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. He had work to do. Not tonight. Tonight, the right move was to go home, check on Evan, and let the next 72 hours begin from a position of patience rather than reaction. Victor Langley had played his hand. That was information, valuable information. Mason drove home through the rainy, smelling night, parked in his usual spot, tipped the babysitter, and stood in the doorway of Evan's room for a long moment, watching his son sleep in the way that parents do when they need to remember what they're actually building things for. Then he went to his desk, opened his laptop, and began preparing for what came next. 500 people had watched Mason Brooks get walked out of a ballroom. Not one of them had stopped to ask a single question. Not one of them had thought to wonder why, in 3 years of working at Novaris Technologies, a man that nobody noticed had never once been wrong about a single thing that mattered. The morning after this gala, Mason woke at 5:15 without an alarm. That was normal for him. His body had settled into early mornings the way it settled into most things. Gradually, without ceremony, until it simply became the way things were. He'd been a light sleeper since Evan was born, trained by years of listening for small sounds in the night. And he'd never quite gone back to sleeping the way he had before fatherhood rearranged his priorities, without asking permission. He lay still for a moment in the dark of his bedroom, listening to the apartment. The particular silence of a place where a child was sleeping. A different quality than ordinary silence, fuller somehow, weighted with responsibility in a way that Mason had never tried to explain to anyone who didn't already know it. Then he got up, started the coffee maker, and sat at his desk in the corner of the living room with his laptop and the notes he'd made the night before, and he thought carefully about the next 72 hours. The acquisition audit window would close in exactly 3 days. Meridian Capital Group's forensic accounting team was already embedded in Novaris's financial systems. That part of the process had been underway for 6 weeks. But the technical audit, the layer that examined the company's core software architecture and verified the integrity of the intellectual property being transferred, was scheduled to begin in 48 hours. That audit would either confirm that Novaris's technology was exactly what it had been represented to be, or it would not. Mason already knew which one it was going to find. What he didn't know yet was how deep the damage went, or whether Victor Langley had moved the original system or simply buried it. He drank his coffee and read through the encrypted data on his external drive. the access log anomalies he'd documented over the past 3 days. And he built a timeline in his head with the careful patience of someone who understood that the difference between a theory and a provable fact was the specific kind of evidence you brought to each step. At 6:40, he heard Evan's feet on the floor in the hallway. Uneven, the shuffle of someone still half asleep but moving toward the kitchen out of biological necessity rather than actual consciousness. Evan appeared in the doorway with his hair organized exclusively by gravity and his pajamas twisted 45 degrees from where they were supposed to be. He looked at Mason's laptop and then at Mason. "Did you sleep?" Evan asked. This was a question he had been asking for about 2 years, ever since he'd noticed that his father sometimes looked the same at 6 in the morning as he'd looked the night before. "Some," Mason said. "Come have breakfast." "Are you in trouble?" Mason looked at his son. "Why do you ask that?" "Because you look like you're doing the face." "What face?" "The one you make when you're thinking about something that you're not going to tell me about because you think it's a grown-up thing." Mason considered that. "I have some work stuff to sort out." "Is it bad work stuff or regular work stuff?" "It's the kind that gets sorted out," Mason said. "Scrambled eggs or cereal?" Evan thought about it with genuine deliberation, which Mason had always found charming about him. "Cereal, but the good kind." "We only have the one kind." "I know. It's still the good kind." They ate together in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window above the sink, and Evan talked about his spelling bee and about a kid at school named Dominic who had gotten out on the word rhythm and had been visibly devastated. And Mason listened and asked questions and was present in the specific way he'd promised himself he would always be present for these mornings, regardless of what else was happening. After Evan left for school on the bus, Mason went back to his desk. He sent 2 emails. One to a corporate attorney he trusted, brief, specific, requesting a confidential meeting before the end of the week. One to his private contact at an independent digital forensics firm that he had retained for exactly this kind of situation, asking them to stand by for a rapid engagement. Then he waited. What happened next, he knew, would come from inside Novaris, and it would come soon. He was right. It came by 10:15 in the morning in the form of a phone call from the company's head of HR, a careful woman named Sandra Cho, who had the voice of someone trying very hard to be both kind and official at the same time. "Mason, I need to formally notify you that your contractor access has been suspended pending investigation. You'll receive the written notice within the hour, but I wanted to call personally rather than, I understand, Sandra." A pause. "Okay. The investigation period is expected to last however long it lasts," Mason said. "That's fine." Another pause, longer this time. "Mason, for what it's worth, I want you to know that—" She stopped herself, HR instincts wrestling with human ones. "You're doing your job," Mason said, the same thing he told Torres the night before. "I know that. It's fine." He hung up and sat back in his chair. Outside the window, the street was doing its mid-morning things. A dog walker with too many dogs. A delivery truck double-parked with its hazards blinking, 2 women talking on the steps of the building across the street. Normal, unremarkable, Tuesday morning life. Mason looked at it for a while. Then he called the one person inside Novaris who he'd maintained a carefully limited but genuine relationship with over the past 3 years. Not a friendship exactly, but something like mutual professional regard built on Mason having fixed 3 separate crises that the other man had been credited with solving. His name was Daniel Park. He was 27, a systems engineer in the architecture team, the youngest person in that department and probably the most naturally talented, which was exactly the reason Victor Langley had never promoted him. Daniel answered on the second ring. "I heard," Daniel said before Mason could speak. "I figured you had." "Mason, what is— I mean, I know the logs they're pointing at. I've seen them, and I know your work well enough to know that the structure of those access patterns doesn't look like anything you'd actually do. You don't work that way. You're too methodical to leave traces like that." "I appreciate that." "So someone faked it. Someone used a copy of my credential." Daniel went quiet for a moment. Okay, that's a different thing than I was thinking. That means someone inside the company had access to the credential database at the admin level."
Keep thinking about that and tell me where it leads you. A longer pause.
That's above my clearance level. Only a few people have access to the admin credential vault. I know. Mason. Daniel's voice had dropped, the volume change of someone suddenly aware that conversations could be overheard. What's actually going on? Like, what are we actually talking about here? I can't tell you the whole picture right now. What I can tell you is that in the next 48 hours, the technical audit team is going to begin examining the core architecture, and they're going to find something that I need you to be ready to document when it happens. Document how? When they flag an anomaly, and they will. I need you to be the one who raises your hand and asks to examine the original deployment logs, not the modified reports in the management system, the raw server logs, the ones archived in the cold storage partition on server block 7. A very long silence. Daniel, Mason said, those logs still exist. I made sure of that before I was walked out last night. Nobody has touched them. But someone will, and they need to be secured by someone with legitimate access before that happens. You're asking me to... I'm asking you to do your job, Mason said. When the anomaly surfaces, ask for the original logs, that's all. Can you do that? Daniel exhaled. It was the exhale of a 27-year-old who understood that he was being asked to step into something large and was trying to calculate whether he had the nerve for it. Mason waited because that was a calculation that couldn't be rushed. Yeah, Daniel said finally. Yeah, I can do that. Good, Mason said. And Daniel, don't discuss this with anyone at the director level or above until the audit team is already in the room. Not because I think you can't trust your own judgment, but because I don't know who's involved yet, Daniel finished. That's right. Mason hung up. He had planted two things in the company's soil, the archived logs and Daniel's awareness of them. Now the thing to do was wait for the auditors to start digging and let the ground do what it was going to do. He made another coffee. He worked on the timeline. He ate a sandwich at noon that he made without thinking about it. Peanut butter. Slightly too much peanut butter, the kind of lunch you made when you were occupied with something else. He pulled Evan's drawing off the refrigerator and put it on the desk next to his laptop. Not for any particular reason, just because it was there, and the desk was where he was spending his time. It was a drawing of a house with two figures in front of it, green grass. A yellow sun in the corner, the kind 8-year-olds drew because it was a sun, and suns needed to be in the picture. One tall figure, one small figure, both with blocky crayon smiles that the child artist had not attempted to make realistic and hadn't needed to. Mason looked at it for a while. Then he went back to work. The first real tremor reached him by late Wednesday afternoon, 30 hours after the gala, 2 hours before the technical audit team was scheduled to brief the board on their preliminary findings. Daniel texted him 3 words. They found it. The it in question landed in the Novaris boardroom like a depth charge. Mason reconstructed what happened from 3 separate accounts. Daniel's careful recap, a message from his attorney who had a contact adjacent to the Meridian Capital audit team, and a brief, tense voicemail from Sandra Cho that she would almost certainly regret leaving, but that Mason appreciated for its honesty. The forensic technical team had gone into Novaris's core software architecture, expecting to verify, and instead found something that made the lead auditor pause mid-sentence during his own presentation and asked to have the room cleared of all non-essential personnel. The encryption framework at the center of Novaris's most valuable intellectual property, the architecture that protected its core data security product and formed the technical foundation of the entire acquisition, was wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not the kind of wrong that a casual inspection would catch. The kind of wrong that only became visible when you compared what was currently in the system against a certified original baseline. When you ran a deep structural comparison and found that the load-bearing bones of the thing had been quietly, expertly replaced while everyone was looking at the surface. It was a counterfeit, a sophisticated one, the kind that required intimate knowledge of the original system to replicate well enough to survive casual examination. The kind that required, specifically, the level of knowledge that only 1 or 2 people in the world actually possessed. Meridian Capital suspended the acquisition within 4 hours of the preliminary finding. Not canceled, suspended, pending clarification, which was the corporate equivalent of someone setting down a glass carefully because they'd just noticed the liquid inside was a different color than they'd poured. Technically reversible. But the clock was now running, Mason sat in his apartment and watched his phone and let the information arrive in pieces. And he thought about chess, about the specific sensation of watching an opponent's move reveal the structure of their entire strategy, about the way that a board you'd been reading as close suddenly opened into clarity. Victor had done this in stages. Mason was now certain of it, not as a panicked response to the acquisition, but as a long-planned operation that the acquisition had merely set a deadline for. The acquisition's audit window had been the forcing function. Victor had needed to move the original architecture before the auditors could certify it, because a certified original would have revealed that someone had already begun altering it. He'd used Mason's credential as the cover story, framed it to look like an insider data theft, which gave him both a scapegoat and a reason to deny auditors access to certain server partitions. The frame had worked well enough to get Mason out of the building. It had not worked well enough to remove what Mason had already secured. And it had not worked at all on Daniel Park, who, Mason learned Thursday morning, had quietly, methodically, with the careful paper trail of a man who understood exactly what he was doing, accessed the cold storage archive on server block 7 and formally logged a request for independent review of the raw deployment records. Daniel sent a single message at 7:48 Thursday morning. I found what you said would be there. I've logged it properly. 3 witnesses from the audit team. Victor Langley tried to close the request. I refused. Mason sat with that message for a long moment. He tried to close the request. That meant Victor knew the archive was a problem. That meant Victor was now moving from offense to damage control, which was a completely different kind of operation and one that Victor was considerably less well prepared for, because damage control required improvisation. And Mason had learned long ago that Victor Langley was not an improviser. He was a planner. Take away his plan, and what you had left was a man with excellent surface confidence and no second act. Mason texted back, "Stay in the room. Don't sign anything Victor's office sends you. I'll be in touch." He closed his laptop. He was beginning to feel the shape of how this would resolve, but he wasn't there yet. What he needed now was something that couldn't be delivered by a text message or a phone call or an archived server log. He needed to be back inside the building. And the only person who could make that happen was sitting in the Novara CEO's office on the 23rd floor, trying to understand why a company she believed in was quietly coming apart at every seam. Olivia Carter had not slept well in 4 days. She would not have admitted this to anyone in the company, because admitting it would have required admitting that she didn't have the situation contained, and she had spent 3 years building a leadership identity that was premised on situations being contained. She was the person who absorbed disorder and produced clarity. She was the person who walked into a bad meeting and walked out with a workable plan. That was the story of Olivia Carter, and she had worked extremely hard to make it true. But the story of the past 4 days was not that story. She sat in her office Thursday afternoon with the audit team's preliminary report on her desk. 12 pages of technical findings that she understood about 60% of, which was more than most CEOs would have and less than she needed right now. And she thought about the things that didn't fit together. The acquisition was suspended. That was a catastrophe measured in months of work and hundreds of millions of dollars. The board was in emergency session every 8 hours. Victor was handling the communication with Meridian Capital, or said he was, though Olivia had noticed in the last 24 hours a quality in Victor's communication that she couldn't name precisely. A slight excess of smoothness, the way an explanation that's been carefully prepared feels different from an explanation that's simply true. She couldn't name it. She was trying to name it when her executive assistant knocked and said, "Ms. Carter, I know you said no interruptions, but there's a call from engineering that I think you should take." The call was from Daniel Park. I was quiet on the phone, deliberate, with the manner of someone who had prepared what he was going to say and was trying not to deviate from it. He told her about the server block 7 archive. He told her about the formal request for independent review. He told her about Victor's attempt to close the request. Then he said, "Ms. Carter, I worked alongside Mason Brooks for 2 years. I'm not asking you to take my word for anything, but the raw logs exist, and they tell a completely different story than what's in the management system. And if you look at who was in the management system making changes to those reports, it's not—" He stopped himself. "I think you should look at the original logs yourself." Olivia sat with that for a moment. "Why are you calling me directly, Daniel? Why not go through your director?" A pause.
Because my director is on Victor's team, Daniel said simply. She dismissed her executive assistant, sat alone in her office, and thought about what it meant that a junior engineer had just called her directly because he didn't know who to trust. And she thought about Mason Brooks, about the way he'd stood in the middle of 500 people and said, at a perfectly normal volume, that's not accurate. Not shouting, not pleading, not panicking, just stating it the way you stated a fact, the way you stated it when you knew you were right and had decided not to perform the wrongness for the crowd. She thought about what he'd said before security walked him out. You're going to need me back. She had dismissed it at the time as the exit line of a man trying to salvage something. Pride, leverage, the last word. That was how she'd filed it. But sitting in her office now with an acquisition suspended and a board demanding answers and a COO whose explanations were starting to feel too prepared, she found the memory of those 5 words sitting differently in her chest. Not bravado. A statement of fact. She picked up her phone and called Sandra Cho. I need Mason Brooks's home address, she said. Personal visit. Don't log it. Well, she drove herself. That part mattered to her, though she couldn't have fully explained why. She had a driver available, the company provided one, but she told him to take the evening and she drove her own car, a dark gray sedan that was nice but not ostentatiously so, through 30 minutes of city traffic to a neighborhood that was clean and quiet and ordinary in every direction. The apartment building was 3 stories, brick, with a small parking lot and a row of mail slots in the lobby that had seen better decades. Olivia sat in her car for a moment in the visitor spot and looked at the building and thought about the distance between this and the 14th floor of the Meridian Grand Ballroom, and about the fact that Mason Brooks traveled that distance every day without anyone at the company having registered it as remarkable. She went to the 3rd floor apartment and knocked. There was a pause, long enough that she wondered if she'd gotten the wrong unit, and then the sound of feet, and a child's voice saying something she couldn't quite hear, and then the door opened. Mason Brooks stood in the doorway in jeans and a t-shirt, a dish towel over one shoulder, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who was not surprised to see her and had decided before opening the door how he was going to handle this. Behind him, at a kitchen table covered in paper and colored pencils, a boy looked up with frank curiosity. Ms. Carter, Mason said. Mr. Brooks. She hesitated. Can I come in? He considered it for a brief moment. Not rudely, but genuinely considered it, the way a person considered something when they were actually thinking rather than performing thinking. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. The apartment was small and tidy in the unself-conscious way of someone who kept things organized out of habit rather than for appearances. Books on the shelves in no particularly impressive order. A drawing taped to the wall near the window. Childlike, colorful, a house with 2 figures. A couch with a throw blanket that had migrated to one end and stayed there. Evan, Mason said, can you give us a few minutes in the kitchen? The boy, 8 years old, Mason's eyes, a spray of pencil marks on his left hand from whatever he'd been drawing, gathered his papers with a dignity that was somehow both entirely childlike and oddly formal. Nice to meet you, he said to Olivia as he passed, with the manner of someone who had been taught that you said this and believed it was worth saying. Nice to meet you too, Olivia said, and found that she meant it. She and Mason sat at the kitchen table. He didn't offer her coffee, which she registered and respected. This wasn't that kind of visit, and he wasn't pretending it was. I'm not here officially, she said. I know. I've seen the archive request Daniel Park filed. I've read the preliminary audit findings. She put her hands flat on the table, a gesture she wasn't fully conscious of. I need to understand what's actually happening inside my company. Mason looked at her for a moment. Okay, he said, but first I have a question for you. All right. The evidence Victor presented at the gala, the access logs, the credential trace, the case against me, who gave you that information? Olivia held his gaze. Victor did. He said the security team had confirmed. Did you verify it independently? She opened her mouth, closed it. Did you or anyone on your direct team look at the raw authentication data, or did you look at a summary that Victor's department generated? The silence between them lasted about 4 seconds. In another kind of room, it would have felt like an accusation. In this kitchen, at this table, it felt like something worse. A mirror. A summary, she said. Mason nodded. Not with satisfaction, not with reproach. Just acknowledgement.
Someone inside your company has compromised the core encryption architecture. They replaced the original with a functional replica. Good enough to pass surface inspection, not good enough to survive a deep forensic audit. The timing was precise, close enough to the acquisition deadline that they expected the audit to be the mechanism of discovery, with me already positioned as the responsible party. Olivia felt the particular cold of a thing clicking into place that you've been refusing to let click. Victor. Mason didn't confirm it. Not yet. I need access to the original server archives, the ones in cold storage that Daniel flagged. And I need access before someone with a senior credential decides those archives are a problem. If I bring you back officially, not officially, Mason said. Not yet. Officially is the wrong move right now because officially requires going through channels, and we don't know which channels are clean. He leaned forward slightly. Bring me back as an independent consultant retained directly by the CEO's office. That keeps the engagement off the standard reporting chain and gives me access to the archives without triggering whoever is watching the system for exactly this kind of move. Olivia sat with that. It was not, she noted, the demand of a man seeking revenge or vindication. It was a specific operational request from someone who had clearly been thinking about the sequence of moves required for days. You came prepared for this conversation, she said. I've had 4 days, Mason said, and I haven't been sleeping much. The honesty of that landed somewhere unexpected. She'd come here ready for, she wasn't sure, a confrontation, an explanation, a man who was either right or wrong. She hadn't come ready for a tired 32-year-old sitting in a kitchen with a dish towel on his shoulder who was giving her exactly what she needed with none of the performance she'd expected. If I do this, she said, and what you find doesn't point where you're suggesting it points, then you'll have lost nothing except the goodwill you already spent, Mason said, and you'll have the original server logs, which you should want regardless of where they point. She thought about Daniel Park's voice on the phone. I think you should look at the original logs yourself. She thought about 4 days of a board wanting answers she didn't have. She thought about 500 people watching her make a decision in 3 seconds that she hadn't verified in 3 minutes. All right, Olivia said. I'll have the consultant agreement sent to you by tonight. She stood to go. At the door, she stopped. Mr. Brooks? At the gala? When security was walking you out, you said I was going to need you back. She looked at him. Did you know then? How bad it was? Mason picked up the dish towel that had fallen from his shoulder. I knew it was going to get worse before anyone else could see how bad it already was. He paused. That's usually how these things go. She left. Walking back to her car in the parking lot, she passed the brick wall of the building and the row of mail slots in the lobby visible through the glass door, and she thought about what it said about her, about the leader she believed herself to be, that she had stood in a ballroom and pointed a finger at a man in a craft fair lanyard without asking a single question. She sat in her car for a moment before starting it. Then she started it and drove back toward the 23rd floor, and the board, and the company that was coming apart at its seams, and the man she'd just hired to help her find out exactly why. Back in the apartment, Evan had migrated back to the kitchen table with his colored pencils, apparently done with granting adults their requested privacy. Was that about the work stuff? He asked, without looking up from his drawing. Yes, Mason said. Is it getting sorted out? Mason looked at his son bent over the paper, the pencil moving with the focused confidence of a kid who knew exactly what he was drawing and had committed to it completely. It's starting to, Mason said. Evan nodded, apparently satisfied. I'm drawing the house again, he said, but I'm putting someone else in it. Oh yeah? 3 people this time, Evan said. He looked up then, briefly, with an expression that was both entirely innocent and somehow precisely targeted. I think it looks better with 3. Mason sat down across from his son and watched him draw, and didn't say anything, and let the apartment be quiet around them, while the city moved outside the window, and the next 48 hours waited in the dark, like something patient. The consultant agreement arrived in Mason's email at 9:47 that evening, while Evan was brushing his teeth and arguing, muffled by toothpaste, that the proper brushing time was 30 seconds and not the full 2 minutes that the dentist had recommended, and that Mason was now enforcing with a small sand timer on the bathroom shelf. The dentist doesn't even brush for 2 minutes, Evan said, appearing in the hallway with foam on his chin. You don't know that? I bet he doesn't. Rinse and spit, Mason said, looking at his phone. The agreement was clean and specific, 4 pages, drafted by Olivia's personal attorney rather than Novaris's internal legal team, which told Mason that she'd understood his point about channels without needing it restated. Independent consultant engagement, retained directly by the office of the CEO, scope limited to technical forensic review of server architecture and authentication systems. Compensation listed at a figure that was, Mason noted, considerably more than he'd earned in any quarter as a contractor, though that part was irrelevant to why he was signing it. He signed it at 10:15 after Evan was asleep. He sent a one-line message to Olivia. "I'll be there at 7. She replied 4 minutes later. "I'll have your access ready." He set his alarm for 5:30 and tried to sleep. He managed about 4 hours of something that qualified, technically, as sleep in the way that a granola bar technically qualified as a meal. I was at his desk by 5:45 with coffee and his notes, running through the sequence of what he needed to do once he was inside the building, organizing the steps the way he organized everything. Not by how he felt about them, but by the order in which they needed to happen to produce a verifiable result. What he needed, at the core of it, was this: a complete, unbroken chain of evidence. Not just the server logs, not just the archive. The connection between the falsified records in the management system and the hands that had falsified them. Digital forensics was a language, and like any language, it had grammar. The relationship between timestamps and user credentials and access patterns and system behavior told a story, but only if you could read every sentence in order and show that none of them had been changed after the fact. Mason could read that language. He'd written parts of it. The problem was that Victor Langley also understood it. Not at Mason's level, but enough to have constructed a very convincing false story using the grammar correctly, which meant that dismantling that story required going deeper than the falsified layer, into the raw substrate of the system where records existed that were genuinely immutable, where the original truth of what had happened was preserved in the only way digital things could be preserved, not because someone had protected it, but because the system itself didn't know it was supposed to be hidden. Evan appeared at 6:20, still in his pajamas, and stood in the kitchen doorway watching his father pack a laptop bag with the focused attention of a child cataloging something. "You're going somewhere," Evan said. "Back to the office." "I thought they kicked you out." "They let me back in." Evan considered this with the pragmatic flexibility of an 8-year-old who understood that adult situations were complicated and didn't always require full explanation. "Are you going to fix it?" "That's the plan." "And then will things be normal again?" Mason zipped the bag and looked at his son. Evan's hair was doing the gravity thing again. He had a small mark on his cheek from where his pillowcase had pressed, the temporary topography of sleep. He was looking at his father with an expression that was trying to be casual and was not entirely succeeding, because children who have learned that things can go wrong without warning develop an antenna for when their primary person is operating in a different register than usual, and Evan's antenna was quite good. "Things are going to be fine," Mason said, and because he understood the difference between comforting a child and lying to one, he added, "It's going to be a complicated couple of days, but I know what I'm doing." "Okay," Evan said. He thought for a moment. "Can I have cereal?" "You can have cereal." "The good kind?" "Still only the one kind." They ate together, briefly, before the school bus. And it was not a long breakfast or a particularly significant one in any external sense. But Mason stored it carefully in the part of himself that kept the things worth keeping, because he'd learned the hard way that the moments that mattered most often didn't announce themselves. He dropped Evan at the bus stop, watched the bus pull away, and drove to Novaris Technologies for the first time since a security guard named Torres had held the door for him on the way out. The building looked the same. That was always slightly disorienting. Returning to a place where something significant had happened to you and finding that the physical space had retained no memory of it whatsoever. The parking lot was the same parking lot. The lobby was the same lobby. Dana was at the reception desk, and she looked up when Mason came through the door, and her expression did something complicated. Relief and guilt and professional uncertainty all moving across her face in the span of about a second before she settled it back into something composed. "Mason," she said. Then, correcting for the awkwardness of the informality, "Mr. Brooks." "Morning, Dana," Mason said. "You can still call me Mason." Yes, okay." She looked at her screen. "I have you here as a consultant engagement, CEO office authorization.
I've got your temporary pass ready. She slid a badge across the desk and then hesitated. I'm glad you're back, she said quietly, with the particular directness of someone who had decided to say the true thing rather than the appropriate thing. What happened the other night wasn't... She stopped. I know, Mason said.
He picked up the badge. Thank you, Dana. He took the elevator to the third floor, bypassed his old office, which now had a small piece of tape over the keycard reader, he noticed, the universal corporate symbol of an access that had been specifically revoked, and went directly to the server room at the end of the east corridor. Daniel Park was already there, which Mason had expected, leaning against the corridor wall with the posture of someone who had been waiting for longer than the last few minutes, and was trying not to look like it. Daniel was young, 27, with the specific energy of a person whose intelligence had always slightly outrun their comfort with their own intelligence. He pushed off the wall when he saw Mason and started to say something, and then didn't, and then settled for putting out his hand. Mason shook it. You did good, he said. I just filed a request. You filed it when someone with a lot more authority than you tried to prevent it. That's not nothing. Mason looked at the server room door. Is the archive partition still clean? As of an hour ago. I checked it this morning before anyone else was in the building. Daniel paused. Victor's assistant called my direct line last night. Said Victor wanted to meet with me this morning to discuss my recent request. I said I was busy. That was the right call? It did not feel like the right call at the time, Daniel said honestly. It felt like I was going to get fired. You might still get threatened with it, Mason said. Don't accept any meeting with Victor without another person in the room, and document every attempt to contact you. Daniel looked at him. How are you this calm? I'm not particularly calm, Mason said. I just know what the next steps are. He badged into the server room. The cold storage partition on server block 7 was exactly where Mason had left it. A segmented archive system he'd built into the infrastructure in the company's third year of operation, designed originally as a redundancy measure, maintained since then as the kind of quiet insurance that you hoped you'd never need. The system automatically preserved raw operational logs in an immutable format, time-stamped by an independent clock that didn't sync with the main network, which meant that the timestamps couldn't be altered retroactively without leaving a specific signature of the attempt. Victor had not tried to alter them. Mason thought about that as he connected his equipment and began pulling the archive data. Victor was smart enough to know that touching the cold storage archive would have required a level of access that would itself have been logged. A recursion problem, the digital equivalent of painting over a wall and leaving the brush marks. So he'd left the archive alone and worked instead on the layer above it, the management system and the edited reports, and the fabricated access logs that pointed at Mason's credential. That was the mistake, because the archive and the management system now told two completely different stories about the same events, and the delta between those two stories was the shape of everything Victor had done. Mason worked through the morning with the kind of focused silence that other people sometimes mistook for coldness. Daniel came in and out, bringing information, asking questions, keeping track of what needed to be logged and witnessed. At 10:30, the independent digital forensics specialist Mason had retained, a woman named Dr. Priya Nair, who ran a firm out of a building across town and had a professional reputation built on 15 years of court-admissible work, arrived with her own equipment and began the formal evidence documentation process. Priya was 44 and had the effect of someone who had seen so much corporate malfeasance that individual instances of it no longer surprised her, only interested her. She shook Mason's hand with the business-like warmth of a colleague, not a hired service. Tell me what we're looking at, she said. Management system records show unauthorized access by credential MB Rooks 714 over a 48-hour window beginning Monday at 0200, Mason said. Cold storage archive shows no corresponding access by that credential during that window. Instead, the archive shows a series of accesses by a system-level administrative account, account number SIS admin 009, that don't appear anywhere in the management system records. Priya raised an eyebrow. The admin account accesses were scrubbed from the management layer. Selectively, the scrub itself left a metadata signature. An SIS admin 009. Who holds that credential? In the current management system, it's listed as a deprecated account with no assigned user, Mason pulled up a second screen. In the archive, which captures the system's state at the time of access, it's listed as active and assigned to a specific individual. Priya looked at the screen. She was quiet for a moment. Victor Langley. Victor Langley, Mason confirmed. She exhaled through her nose, not dramatically, just the exhale of someone marking a point on a mental map. Okay, start from the beginning and walk me through everything. I'm going to need this in a format that survives cross-examination. They worked until 1 in the afternoon, building the evidentiary chain with the methodical patience of people who understood that speed was the enemy of accuracy, and that accuracy was right now the only weapon that mattered. Priya documented everything: the archive logs, the management system discrepancy, the metadata signatures of the scrub, the administrative account assignment, the access patterns that mapped precisely to the timeline of the encryption architecture replacement. At 12:40, Daniel knocked on the server room door and came in with an expression that Mason had learned to read as the particular look of someone bringing news they weren't sure how to rank. The board moved the emergency session to 2 o'clock, Daniel said. Victor's been informed. He's requested to address the board directly. His assistant just sent out the meeting update with him added to the agenda. Mason looked at Priya. How much more time do you need? He asked. Another hour to complete the formal documentation chain, Priya said. Then it's court ready. 1 hour, Mason said. He looked at Daniel. Tell Olivia I need to speak with her before the board session. Not after, before. Olivia was in her office on the 23rd floor, standing at her window, when Mason arrived at 1:15. She was looking at the city below with the posture of a person who had made several large decisions in the last 48 hours, and was in the process of organizing her understanding of what that meant. She turned when Mason came in. She looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression was different from the past several times he'd seen her, more open or less fortified, which was not the same thing but was sometimes the closest you could get. Tell me, she said. Victor used a deprecated administrative account assigned to his credentials to access the core encryption architecture. He replaced the original system with a functional replica over a 48-hour window. He then modified the management system records to remove all trace of the admin account activity and substituted fabricated access logs pointing to my contractor credential. Mason set a folder on her desk. The preliminary documentation Priya had compiled into a readable form, deliberately organized for someone who understood business, but not deep systems forensics. The cold storage archive preserved the unmodified record. The discrepancy between the archive and the management system is measurable, time-stamped, and court-admissible. Dr. Nair will have the full documentation ready within the hour. Olivia picked up the folder and looked at it without opening it. What else? She said, because she could tell there was something else. We found the transfer point, Mason said. The original architecture, the actual source code and encryption framework that was replaced, we found where it went. Victor established a data pathway to an external server. The pathway used a routing protocol that was designed to look like standard system maintenance traffic. If you weren't looking for it specifically, you'd read it as background noise. Where did it go? A company called Aaron Systems, registered in Delaware 8 months ago, anonymous ownership structure. He paused. Aaron Systems is in active acquisition discussions with Meridian Capital Group. They're the competing bid. Olivia put the folder down on her desk. She sat in her chair, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who needed to be sitting for what they were processing. He was selling us, she said. It wasn't a question. He was selling the technology, Mason said. The company was the vehicle. If the Novaris acquisition fell apart because of compromised IP, Aaron would emerge as the clean alternative, with technology that would seem remarkably similar to what Novaris had been offering. Olivia's jaw tightened. How long? The data pathway was established 8 months ago. The administrative account manipulation started about 6 months ago, in small increments that were below any alert threshold. The credential forgery that pointed at me was the final step, the cleanup measure that was only necessary because he was ready to move. He was ready to move because the acquisition was announced. The audit window was his deadline, Mason said. He needed the original architecture out of the system before the forensic team could certify it. Olivia was quiet for a moment. Outside, 30 floors below, the city continued to perform its indifference to the specific human disasters unfolding above it. He was in my office yesterday morning, she said. He sat across from me and told me the audit disruption was a manageable setback and that the team was doing everything possible to identify the scope of the contractor breach. Her voice was precise, controlled, but Mason could hear the specific temperature beneath it. Not rage exactly. Something older and quieter than rage. He looked me in the eye. I know. I trusted him. She said it without self-pity, as a factual statement she was still in the process of accepting. When he brought me that evidence at the gala, your name, the logs, the whole thing, I didn't ask one question. I looked at 500 people and I pointed and She stopped. You made a decision with the information you had, Mason said. The information had been designed specifically to lead you to that decision. Don't do that, Olivia said. He looked at her. Don't make it easier than it was, she said. I should have asked. I should have given you 30 seconds to respond before I called security. I didn't do that. I need to sit with that. A beat. But I'll sit with it later. Right now, the board session is at 2. Victor is going to walk into that room and try to control the narrative before we get there. I know, Mason said. What does he say when he realizes what we have? He's going to say that I illegally accessed company systems after my termination, that the documentation I'm presenting was fabricated or obtained improperly. He's going to try to make the board's question be about my access rather than about his. Olivia looked at him steadily. And the answer to that? The answer is that every piece of evidence was obtained through a properly authorized consultant engagement, documented by an independent forensic specialist, with a continuous chain of custody. Daniel Park's actions were taken with proper access and logged with 3 audit team witnesses. Nothing we're presenting required any access that wasn't explicitly authorized. Mason paused. But he's going to try. And some board members will want to believe the simpler version, because the simpler version means the past 3 years of their oversight wasn't completely blind. Olivia nodded slowly. So we need to get there first. We need to be in that room when Victor walks in, Mason said. And I need you to let me present the evidence directly, not through a summary. She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that was actually an assessment, the kind she probably used when she was making decisions about whether to trust the person across from her with something that mattered. All right, she said, you'll present. She stood, straightened the jacket she was wearing with the automatic gesture of someone returning to operational mode, and looked at the folder on her desk. Mason. She said his name with the slight awkwardness of someone using it for the first time in a context where she'd previously used his last name. There's something you should know before we go in there. Something I should have. The board has a file on you. Background information on the contractor roster. I reviewed it this morning. She hesitated. It's incomplete. Deliberately, I think, because certain records about the founding period of the company appear to have been consolidated. Victor managed the board documentation for the first 2 years of my time as a contractor, Mason said. So he controlled what they knew about you. He controlled what most people knew, Mason said. That was part of the arrangement when I stepped back. I needed to be background. I didn't anticipate that the person managing the background information would use that access to rewrite it. Olivia studied him. Who are you really? In terms of this company. Because I've been adding things up since last night, and the math isn't working out to contractor. Mason was quiet for a moment. He'd known this conversation was coming, had known it since the night of the gala, really, since the moment Victor had named him in that ballroom and forced the situation into the open. He'd spent 3 years maintaining the careful distance between what he was and what he appeared to be, and he'd done it for reasons that still seemed to him like good reasons, but the moment for those reasons was closing. I'll answer that question, he said, in the board meeting. The Novaris boardroom was on the 22nd floor, one below Olivia's office, and it was a room designed to communicate institutional weight, dark wood table, leather chairs, the logos of the company's 15 years of achievements arranged along one wall in a sequence that looked like the kind of history that was supposed to be permanent. The board members were already seated when Mason and Olivia entered at 1:55. 7 men and women whose collective net worth represented a significant fraction of a medium-sized country's GDP, all of whom were looking at Mason with the specific expression of people who had been told that someone had been humiliatingly escorted out of a gala 4 days ago and were now processing the cognitive dissonance of seeing that same person walk into their boardroom at the CEO's side. Victor Langley was already there. He was seated 2 chairs from the head of the table, in the position that communicated authority adjacent rather than authority itself. And he looked up when Mason walked in with the expression of a man who had prepared for several scenarios and was now assessing which one this was. He chose, Mason noted, the offense. "I have to object," Victor said, standing, with the measured gravity of a man addressing the room rather than just the 2 people who'd entered. This individual's contractor access was suspended pending investigation. His presence here is a security concern, and I would remind the board that any information he presents carries a significant question of integrity, given. "Mr. Langley," Olivia's voice was flat and even and cut across the room like a piece of glass. "Sit down, please." Victor sat. He did it smoothly, without apparent resentment, which Mason recognized as the discipline of someone who understood that controlled retreat was not the same as surrender. The board chair, a woman in her 60s named Margaret Elroy, who had the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had been in too many rooms like this one to be easily rattled, looked between Olivia and Victor and then at Mason. "Ms. Carter," Margaret said, "the floor." Olivia nodded and remained standing. 4 days ago, at the company gala, I made a public accusation against a contractor based on information that I accepted without independent verification. I want to acknowledge that directly before we proceed, because what I'm about to present to this board is the correct version of events, and you deserve to have it presented by someone who's already admitted the error in how it started. A small silence in the room. Mason watched the board members' faces. Margaret Elroy's expression hadn't changed. 2 others exchanged a brief glance. "Mr. Brooks has been retained as an independent consultant by my office," Olivia continued. "He's going to present the findings from our internal server archive review, conducted in collaboration with Dr. Priya Nair of Nair Digital Forensics. I'll ask for questions at the end." She sat down. Mason stood up. He connected his laptop to the room's display system without any ceremony about it and brought up the first screen, a timeline, clean and legible, the visual representation of what the cold storage archive had preserved. "On Monday of this week," Mason began, "between 2 a.m. and 6:40 a.m., administrative account SYS admin 009 accessed the core encryption architecture of Novaris Technologies' primary software product and initiated a systematic replacement of the original source code with a functional replica. I'm going to walk you through the evidence chain for that statement, and then I'm going to show you where the original architecture went. He was not a performer. He didn't have Victor's weight in a room or Olivia's precision at a podium. He talked the way he talked, plainly, specifically, with the pacing of someone interested in the information rather than the presentation of it. He walked the board through the archive logs and the management system discrepancy and the metadata signatures of the scrub. He showed them the administrative account assignment. He showed them the data transfer pathway. He brought up the screen that showed the destination. "Aaron Systems," he said, "incorporated in Delaware 8 months ago. I have here a document subpoenaed this morning by Dr. Nair's legal team through an expedited forensic review order. I'll note that the order was granted at 11:15 today, and the document arrived at 12:03. He brought up the corporate filing. "The beneficial owner of Aaron Systems, listed in the original incorporation filing before the ownership structure was converted to an anonymous holding entity 6 months ago, is Victor Allen Langley." The room went very quiet. Victor stood. "This is fabricated," he said. His voice was still controlled, still even, but Mason could hear the specific frequency beneath it. Not panic, because Victor didn't panic easily, but the sound of a very good plan encountering the one variable it hadn't accounted for. This individual accessed company systems without authorization after his suspension. Any evidence he presents is legally compromised and, "Mr. Langley," Margaret Elroy's voice was quiet and very final. "The forensic documentation Mr. Brooks is presenting was obtained under an authorized consultant agreement executed by the CEO's office. Dr. Nair's firm will attest to the chain of custody. Unless you have a specific technical objection to the data itself, the data has been manipulated." "Can you point to the specific manipulation?" Mason said. He was not aggressive about it. He just said it the way you asked a question when you already knew the answer. "The archive system timestamps are generated by an independent clock that doesn't sync with the main network. Alteration of those timestamps would require physical access to the server hardware and would leave a specific hardware-level signature. Dr. Nayer's team examined the hardware this morning. There is no such signature. Victor looked at Mason, and Mason looked back at him, and in that moment something passed between them. Not hatred exactly, and not satisfaction, because Mason didn't particularly feel satisfied. What he felt was the quiet that comes at the end of a very long calculation, when the last step resolves, and the answer is exactly what you knew it was going to be. Mr. Brooks. Margaret Elroy was looking at him with an expression that was attentive in a new way, the attentiveness of someone recalibrating. Before we proceed to the formal response, can you tell this board who you are in relation to this company? Because I've reviewed the consultant agreement and the contractor records, and I find that a man who clearly understands this company's technical systems at a foundational level has been sitting in the contractor roster for 3 years, which suggests to me that there is a context here that the board has not been given. Mason took a breath. My name is Mason Brooks, he said, and I built this company. He let that sit for a moment before he continued. 15 years ago, I filed the original incorporation documents for Novaris Technologies. I designed the core architecture that this company has built every subsequent product on. I stepped back from active leadership 7 years ago for personal reasons that I won't go into in this room, and I transitioned to a background role, deliberately invisible, deliberately unacknowledged, because I wanted the company to develop leadership that was independent of its founder. He paused. Under a shareholder agreement that was signed at the time of that transition, I retained 60% of the company's equity in the form of a classified stock structure that was managed by the corporate attorney who drafted the original incorporation. Victor Langley, who was the COO at the time of my transition, was one of 2 witnesses to that agreement. The silence in the room had a different quality now. Margaret Elroy leaned forward slightly. You're saying Victor knew. Victor has known who I am for 7 years, Mason said. He also knew that if the acquisition closed with the original architecture intact and properly certified, the shareholder agreement would require disclosure of the classified equity structure as part of the due diligence completion. My ownership stake would surface, and Victor had spent years positioning himself as the operational power behind Novaris's success. He looked at Victor. The acquisition wasn't just an opportunity to steal and sell the technology. It was a deadline. The deal closing meant I became visible. Victor needed me gone, and the technology gone, before that happened. Victor Langley had gone still. He was still standing. He looked for the first time in the 4 days since the gala, like a man who had run out of prepared responses and was standing in the space where his plan used to be. Victor, Mason said, and his voice was not triumphant and not gentle, just matter of fact, the tone of stating something everyone in the room now understood. Sit down. Victor sat. He sat the way a man sat when the thing he'd been building for years had just come down, with the deflated heaviness of someone whose body understood the outcome before his mind had fully processed it. Margaret Elroy looked at the board members on either side of her. She looked at Olivia. She looked at Mason. Ms. Carter, she said, I believe you have a motion you'd like to bring before the board. Olivia stood. Her voice, when she spoke, was even and clear, and carried the specific weight of someone who had made peace with a necessary thing. I move for the immediate suspension of Victor Langley from all operational duties pending the completion of a criminal investigation, she said. And I move that the board formally acknowledge the shareholder status of Mason Brooks and request his involvement in the recovery of the original system architecture in order to meet the audit deadline. Seconded, said Margaret Elroy, before anyone else could speak. The vote took 40 seconds. It was unanimous. Victor Langley left the boardroom at 2:47 with 2 members of the company's internal security team and the specific silence of a man who had understood, walking in, that this was a possibility, and who had believed, right up until the moment it happened, that he was too careful for it to be the outcome. He had been careful. He just hadn't been careful enough. Mason stood at the display screen in the now quieter boardroom, and he looked at the timeline he'd built, and he thought that the thing about patience was that it only worked if you were willing to let it go all the way to the end. Cutting it short for the satisfaction of a faster resolution was the mistake that most people made. You had to be willing to let it be uncomfortable for longer than felt reasonable. Evan understood that about card games, Mason thought. He'd learned it the hard way, losing hand after hand until he understood that knowing when to hold and when to play was a different skill than knowing the rules. He started packing up his laptop. Olivia was beside him before he finished. "The original architecture," she said. "Can you restore it in time for the audit window?" "I preserved a complete copy before I was walked out of the gala," Mason said. "I've had it in an off-site location for 4 days." Olivia stared at him. "You already had the backup." "I've had a backup since I built the original," Mason said. "I updated it the afternoon before the gala, when I first saw the anomalies in the access logs." She was quiet for a moment. "You knew it was coming." "I knew something was coming," he said. "I didn't know the specific shape of it until Monday night." He closed his laptop bag. "The restoration will take approximately 14 hours. If we start tonight, the system will be certified ready before the audit deadline." Olivia let out a breath that carried approximately 4 days of compression. "Okay," she said. "Okay." Margaret Elroy appeared at Mason's other side, the board chair moving with the quiet purpose of a woman who had just recalibrated a significant number of things. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "I think you and I have a great deal to discuss." "Yes," Mason said. "We do." "I'd like to start with why in the world a man who owns 60% of this company has been parking in the overflow lot." Mason looked at her. Something close to a smile moved across his face. Not a big one, because he wasn't a big smile kind of person, but genuine. "It was a good parking lot," he said. Margaret Elroy looked at him for a moment, and then she made a sound that in another context would have been a laugh. And it was the most human sound Mason had heard in that room all day. The recovery had begun. Margaret Elroy's question about the parking lot stayed with Mason longer than he expected. Not because it was a profound question. It wasn't. It was the kind of dry observation that sharp people made when they were processing something larger and needed a moment of levity to metabolize it. But it stuck because it pointed at something Mason had never fully articulated, even to himself. The reason he'd spent 3 years parking in the far corner of his own company's lot wasn't tactical. Not entirely. It was something older than tactics, something that had started the night Evan was born and had never quite resolved itself into a clean philosophy. He thought about that on the drive home Thursday evening, with the city doing its rush hour performance around him and the truck's heater running about 30% less efficiently than it should have been. He needed to pick up Evan from the after-school program. He'd texted the coordinator from the boardroom, a practical message that contained none of the information about what had just transpired because that was not information the after-school coordinator needed, and he needed to start the restoration process tonight. 14 hours of system restoration meant starting before 9 o'clock to clear the audit window. He had the backup architecture on an encrypted drive in his laptop bag. He had authorization from the board. He had Daniel Park, who had texted 40 minutes ago asking what time he should come back in. He had, technically, everything he needed. What he hadn't had and still didn't have was the language to explain to his 8-year-old son that the situation they'd been circling around for 5 days had turned a corner, and that the corner had revealed things that were going to change the shape of their life in ways that Mason himself hadn't fully mapped yet. He picked up Evan at 5:10. Evan got in the truck with his backpack and the specific energy of a child who had been in a room full of other children for 7 hours and had processed approximately 4 times more social information than any adult would have managed. He talked for the first 6 minutes of the drive without stopping. Something about a kickball dispute that had structural similarities to a labor negotiation, a fact that Mason noted privately with some amusement. And then he ran out of immediate material and looked at his father. "You look different," Evan said. "Different how?" Evan considered. "Less like you're waiting for something." Mason looked at his son for a moment, then back at the road. "Things moved forward today," he said. "At the office." "The work stuff?" "Yeah." "Good move forward or bad move forward?" "Good," Mason said. "But it's going to be a long night. I have to go back in after dinner." Evan accepted this with the equanimity of a kid who had grown up understanding that his father's work operated on schedules that didn't always conform to normal hours. "Can we have the good dinner before you go?" "What's the good dinner?" "Pasta, with the garlic bread." "I think we have everything for that." "Okay," Evan said, and looked out the window with an expression of genuine contentment, because for Evan Brooks, pasta with garlic bread and a father who looked less like he was waiting for something represented a very good Thursday evening,
And he was right about that in a way that Mason was not above being instructed by. They had the pasta, they had the garlic bread. Mason did the dishes, while Evan did homework at the kitchen table with the focused reluctance of someone who understood that the homework needed to happen, but maintained a principled dissatisfaction about it. At 7:15, Mason kissed the top of his son's head, confirmed with the neighbor who sometimes sat with Evan during late work nights, and drove back to Novaris Technologies for the second time that day. The building was different at night, quieter, obviously, the lobby staffed by a different crew, the corridors emptied of their daytime performance of purposeful movement. Mason badged in with his consultant access, took the elevator to the third floor, and found Daniel Park already in the server room with 2 large cups of coffee from the place around the corner that stayed open until midnight. Daniel handed one to Mason without preamble. "The audit team lead called me at 6, Daniel said. Mr. Harmon, the lead forensic technical auditor for Meridian Capital. He wants to be in the building when the restoration completes. He asked if he could observe the process." "That's fine," Mason said. "He should observe. He needs to verify the original architecture is authentic, and watching the restoration is part of that verification." "He's coming in at 9. "Good." Mason set his coffee down and opened his laptop bag. "Let's start now." What followed was not dramatic in the way that the boardroom had been dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was technical and quiet and required sustained attention to a great number of small things in a precise sequence. And it was the kind of work that Mason was better at than almost anything else he did, which was precisely why he'd built this particular backup system the way he'd built it. The original Novaris encryption architecture existed on the encrypted drive in Mason's bag in the form of a complete authenticated copy. Every layer of code, every dependency, every configuration setting, every original file with its original timestamp preserved in a format that could be verified against the cryptographic hash he'd generated when the copy was made. The hash was the thing that made it irrefutable. A mathematical fingerprint of the entire system at the moment of backup, unique and unrepeatable, that could be verified independently by anyone with the right tools. Dr. Nair had already run the hash verification that afternoon, documenting the result as part of the evidentiary chain. The copy was genuine. Now Mason began the process of deploying it back into the system, carefully, layer by layer, with Daniel documenting each step and the server room's logging system recording everything automatically. It was not unlike surgery in the sense that it required both broad knowledge of the whole and precise attention to the specific, and a mistake in the wrong place at the wrong moment could cause damage that would take longer to fix than starting over. Mason did not make mistakes in this kind of work. Not out of brilliance. Brilliance was an overused word that Mason had always been suspicious of, but out of the particular discipline of someone who had learned, early and at genuine cost, that the gap between knowing something and executing it correctly was filled with the quality of attention you brought to the in-between moments. At 9:08, Richard Harmon arrived. He was the Meridian Capital Audit Team lead, 50-something, methodical, with wire-rimmed glasses and the professional bearing of someone who had spent a career translating technical complexity into financial consequence. He shook Mason's hand and introduced himself with an economy of words that Mason appreciated, and then he sat in the corner of the server room with his own laptop and watched. Occasionally he asked questions. They were good questions, specific, structurally sound, the kind that told Mason he was dealing with someone who actually understood what he was looking at rather than performing competence. Mason answered them the same way he answered everything, directly, without elaboration beyond what was necessary. At 11:40, Harmon looked up from his screen. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "the hash verification on Layer 7 just completed. I'm running the comparison against our baseline documentation now." A pause. "The match is exact." "It will be," Mason said, without looking up from what he was doing. "I've been in this business for 22 years, Harmon said, with the tone of a man making an observation rather than a compliment. "I've seen 3 cases of architecture substitution fraud. This is the most technically sophisticated one. Whoever built the replica understood the original system at an architectural level. They had access to the original documentation," Mason said, "for years. Is that how they knew what to copy?" "It's how they knew what needed to be identical and what could be approximated," Mason said. "The approximations were good enough for functional testing. They weren't good enough for a deep cryptographic audit." Harmon was quiet for a moment. "When did you know it had been replaced?"
Mason looked up from his screen. The Monday before the gala. The access patterns in the logs showed activity inconsistent with the maintenance schedule. Small things. The kind that only look meaningful when you know the baseline intimately. And you'd been monitoring the baseline. Since I built it. Harmon looked at him over his glasses with an expression that might have been the forensic accountant's equivalent of respect. The backup you're restoring from, when was it made? The afternoon before the gala, about 6 hours after I first noticed the anomalies. So you already knew, going into the gala, that the architecture had been compromised. I knew it had been accessed in a way that shouldn't have happened. I didn't have the full picture of the replacement until I got into the archive Friday morning. Harmon nodded slowly. You came to the gala anyway. I needed to be visible, Mason said. If I'd stayed away, it would have looked like I knew something was wrong. You did know something was wrong. I knew something was wrong, Mason agreed, but I didn't know yet who'd done it, and I needed whoever had done it to believe their frame was working. Harmon considered that. So you let them walk you out? I let them walk me out, Mason said. And I spent 4 days making sure that when we got to this room, there was nothing Victor Langley could do about what the archive contained. Daniel, who had been listening from across the room with the expression of someone hearing a story he'd been part of but hadn't fully understood at the time, exhaled quietly through his nose. That's cold, Daniel said. It's patient, Mason said. There's a difference. The restoration completed at 12:53 in the morning, every layer verified, every hash matched. Every cryptographic signature confirmed by Harmon's independent tools, documented in real time, recorded in a continuous audit log that now formed part of the formal evidence chain in what Mason's attorney had confirmed, by text message at 10:30, was now a federal investigation. Harmon ran the final verification twice. Then he sat back in his chair, pulled off his glasses, and rubbed his eyes with the exhausted satisfaction of someone reaching the end of something that had required a great deal of sustained attention. The original architecture is restored, he said. My preliminary assessment for Meridian Capital will reflect that the technical foundation of the acquisition is authentic and intact. I'll need to submit the formal report in the morning, but, he looked at Mason, the acquisition can proceed. Daniel made a sound that was not quite a word but was clearly an expression of relief. The involuntary sound of someone whose nervous system had been operating at a sustained high pitch for 5 days and had just been given permission to come down from it. Mason nodded. He closed his laptop and sat for a moment in the quiet of the server room, the particular quiet of a place full of machines that were doing their jobs correctly, a sound that Mason had always found reassuring in the way that some people found music reassuring, the hum of things working as intended. He'd built these machines. He'd built the systems that ran on them. He'd built the company around those systems 15 years ago in a different chapter of his life when he'd been a different version of himself. Younger, less patient, still learning the difference between building something and knowing what it was for. He knew what it was for now. He picked up his phone and looked at the time. Almost 1 in the morning. Evan would be asleep for another 5 hours. The neighbor had a key and had confirmed she'd stay the night, because Mason had learned years ago that some nights required advance arrangements, and tonight had been one of them. He had a message from Olivia, sent at 12:31. I'm still in the building. Board wants a briefing the moment the restoration completes. He texted back. It's done. Her reply was immediate, which told him she'd been sitting with her phone, coming down. She arrived with Margaret Elroy and 2 other board members who had apparently also been in the building at 1 in the morning, which told Mason something about the quality of people Novaris had at the top, even when other things had gone badly wrong. Harmon gave them a 15-minute summary that was precise and clear and carried the specific authority of an independent expert making a formal assessment rather than a partisan presentation. The board members asked focused questions. Harmon answered them. When it was over, Margaret Elroy looked at Mason. The audit window holds? She asked. The audit window holds, Harmon confirmed, with the caveat that I'll need to complete the formal documentation in the morning, but there are no technical barriers to the acquisition proceeding on schedule. Margaret looked at Olivia. Something passed between them. The compressed communication of 2 people who had been in enough hard situations together to have developed a shorthand. All right, Margaret said. She looked around the server room, the equipment, the cables, Daniel Park with dark circles under his eyes, and coffee cup number 3 in his hand, Mason closing cables back into their housings with the unhurried efficiency of someone who kept his work tidy on principle. I want to say something to this room. Informally, at 1 in the morning, with full acknowledgement that there will be formal processes for everything that comes next. She had everyone's attention. A serious crime was committed against this company, Margaret said. It was committed by someone we trusted with its operation, and it was nearly successful. The reason it failed is that one person understood what had been done and did not react with ego or panic or the need to be immediately vindicated. He took 4 days and built an airtight case, and in doing so, he protected every person whose livelihood is connected to this company. I want that acknowledged in this room by this group before we go back to the formal processes. It was quiet in the server room. Then Harmon said, "Seconded," which was not precisely how informal acknowledgments worked, but which Mason appreciated for its specificity. Olivia was looking at Mason with an expression he didn't have a word for. Not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it, and not apology, though that was part of it too. It was the expression of someone in the middle of genuinely revising their understanding of something that had seemed settled. "Thank you," she said. She said it to the room, but she said it toward Mason. "The company didn't need me to be a hero," Mason said. "It needed the original architecture back in the system before the audit deadline. Those are different things. The company needed someone who had more invested in its survival than in being seen to save it," Margaret Elroy said, with the precision of a woman who chose her words deliberately. "Which, it turns out, is exactly what we had." She said goodnight. The board members followed. Harmon packed up his equipment with the organized efficiency of someone who'd been doing field work for 22 years and had developed very good habits about it. Daniel walked with Mason to the elevator. "So what happens now?" Daniel asked. "Like, tomorrow. What does normal look like after all of this?" "I honestly don't know yet," Mason said. "The legal process around Victor will take time. The board is going to have a lot of questions about the founding structure and the shareholder agreement. The acquisition will move forward through its process." He paused. "What happens to you is that you should be recognized properly for what you did this week." Daniel shook his head slightly. "I filed an archive request." "You filed it when Victor tried to prevent it, with your director on Victor's team, with no guarantee of how it was going to land. You did that because you understood what was right, and you were 27 years old with a lot to lose." Mason looked at him. "Don't undersell it." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to be... now that the board knows who you are, what does that mean for... Are you coming back? Like, actually back?" The elevator arrived. Mason got in. He held the door for a moment before it closed. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I need to think about what makes sense. For the company and for..." He paused. "For other things." Daniel nodded, with the understanding of someone who had met Evan and had done the arithmetic. The elevator closed. Mason rode down to the lobby alone and walked through the empty reception area where Dana's desk sat unmanned and the lobby coffee machine stood in its habitual functional silence, and he went out the glass doors into the early morning air. It was cold and clean, and the city was as quiet as it ever got. He stood on the sidewalk for a minute, not because he needed to. He was tired, genuinely tired in the way that came after sustained intensity rather than just late hours, but because the night air felt like a transition point, the physical space between what had just happened and whatever came next. His phone buzzed. He looked at it, expecting a legal message or a board follow-up. It was a text from Olivia. "I know it's late, but I'm glad I came to your apartment the other night, even though I didn't handle the thing that led to it well. I'm glad I asked." Mason looked at the message for a moment. He typed back, "Go home. Get some sleep." A pause. Then, "You too." He put his phone in his pocket and walked to his truck in the lot. Not the far overflow lot. The board had, earlier that day, issued him a permanent pass for the covered executive spots by the east entrance. A practical correction of something that had been practically wrong, offered by Margaret Elroy with the dry humor of someone who had found the parking lot detail genuinely absurd. He had not used the new spot tonight. He'd parked where he always parked, out of habit more than anything, the kind of habit that took more than one good day to redirect. He sat in the truck for a moment. The star stickers on the dashboard caught the ambient light of the parking lot in a small, indistinct way. You'd have to know they were there to see them, which was true of a lot of things that mattered. He drove home. The call from Victor Langley's attorney came Friday morning at 9:47 while Mason was making coffee and Evan was eating breakfast before school. Mason stepped into the bedroom and closed the door. The attorney, a man named Prescott, with the voice of someone very expensive who wanted you to know it without being gauche about it, was calling to communicate an informal message from his client. The message was dressed in legal language, but its structure was simple. Victor wanted to meet. Privately, without attorneys on either side, before the situation became more formal than it had already become. My client believes there may be aspects of the history between himself and Mr. Brooks that could be addressed in a way that serves both parties' interests, Prescott said, which was the kind of sentence that was designed to sound like an opening and mean as little as possible. I'll talk to my attorney and get back to you, Mason said. He hung up and stood in his bedroom doorway for a moment. His attorney, when Mason called her at 10:15, was a woman named Claire Voss who had been practicing corporate and criminal law for 18 years and had the particular gift of stating her opinion in exactly the number of words it required. Don't meet him, Claire said. Not privately, not without me, not at all actually, until the federal investigation has established its formal interview schedule. Any informal meeting creates a record that can be characterized as negotiation, which muddies the evidentiary waters. I know, Mason said. Then why did you call me instead of just not going? Because I wanted to make sure my instinct was right. A brief pause. Your instinct is right, Claire said. Don't go. And Mason, we need to talk about the disclosure requirement. The shareholder agreement has a provision about mandatory disclosure when the equity structure becomes material to an active acquisition. The board's recognition of your ownership yesterday may have triggered the clock on that. I know that too. You've known about this provision for 3 years. Yes. Were you... Claire stopped herself. He could hear her deciding whether to ask what she was actually thinking. Were you waiting for something specific before triggering disclosure? Mason leaned against the wall of his bedroom and looked at the framed photo of Evan on his dresser. The school picture from 2nd grade, slightly overexposed, Evan's smile wide and specific and not performing anything. I was waiting to find out what the company was made of, Mason said, without me in the room. Claire was quiet for a moment. And I found out, she exhaled. Okay, come in this afternoon and we'll start building the disclosure documentation. The board is going to want the full equity structure on the table before the Meridian deal closes. That's fine, Mason said. Mason, the 60%. When Meridian closes, that becomes a very large number in dollar terms. I know what it becomes. Are you prepared for that? He looked at the photo of Evan. 8 years old, 2nd grade, the smile of a kid who didn't know yet what his father had built, or how long he'd been protecting it, or what it was going to be worth when the numbers finally became visible. I've been prepared for a long time, Mason said. I was just waiting for the right moment to not be invisible anymore. He said goodbye to Claire and went back to the kitchen, where Evan was finishing his cereal and looking at the drawings on the refrigerator with the particular expression he got when he was thinking about art. The bus comes in 8 minutes, Mason said. I know. Evan kept looking at the drawings. Dad. Yeah. When things are all the way fixed, at work, is stuff going to change? Like change? Mason poured his coffee. He thought about Margaret Elroy and Claire Voss and a number that was going to become visible soon. He thought about a covered parking spot he hadn't used yet. He thought about Olivia's text at 1 in the morning and about 14 hours of server restoration work and about the original architecture running again in the machines he'd built 15 years ago. Some things, he said honestly. Not everything. Evan considered that with the thoroughness he brought to most things. Good changes or regular changes? Mostly good, Mason said. Some just different. Okay. Evan slid off his chair and picked up his backpack. As long as we still have breakfast. We still have breakfast. And the cereal. Okay, Evan said, with the finality of someone who had determined that his essential requirements were going to be met and could therefore proceed with his day. He headed for the door and then stopped and came back and hugged Mason around the middle with the unself-conscious force of an 8-year-old who had not yet learned to modulate the physical expression of feeling. Mason put his hand on the back of his son's head
and held it there for a moment. "Go catch your bus," he said. Evan let go and went. Mason stood in the quiet kitchen for a minute after the door closed, with his coffee and the sound of the street outside and the drawings on the refrigerator, the house with 2 figures, and next to it the newer one with 3. And he thought about 15 years and what they added up to, and about what came after a long time of being invisible when you finally chose to be seen. It wasn't simple. It was never going to be simple. There would be legal processes and board negotiations and public disclosures and all the complicated machinery of the world, recognizing something it had previously been arranged to ignore. There would be Victor's legal team and Claire's legal team and Meridian Capital's team and a dozen other parties with interests that would need to be managed with care. But the architecture was restored. The backup had held. The evidence chain was intact. The company would survive. And somewhere across the city, in the Novaris Technologies building with its covered executive parking and its crystal chandeliers returned to whatever European warehouse rented them for events, the machines Mason had built were running correctly again, doing the quiet work of protecting information in a world that underestimated quiet things at its consistent peril. He finished his coffee. He had a meeting with Claire at 2. He had a call with the board at 4. He had a message from Daniel Park asking when Mason wanted to begin the formal architectural review that the board had requested in order to verify nothing else had been altered in the system during Victor's tenure. He texted Daniel back, "Monday morning, 7 a.m., bring coffee." Daniel's reply was a single thumbs up, followed by, "Is it okay if I'm scared of you a little?" Mason looked at that for a moment, and something moved across his face that was closer to a real smile than most people had seen from him in years. "That's fine," he typed back. "Most things worth doing are a little scary." He put his phone in his pocket, grabbed his laptop bag, and left the apartment. In the hallway, he nearly walked into Mrs. Callahan from 3C, who was coming out with her grocery bags and who had never in 3 years asked Mason what he did for work, but who had watched Evan through various school year emergencies with the reliable kindness of a woman who understood that neighboring meant showing up. "Mason," she said, "Mrs. Callahan, let me get those." He took the grocery bags and walked her to the elevator, and they talked about the weather and about Evan's spelling bee, which Mrs. Callahan had heard about through the building's informal information network that Mason had never fully mapped, but which seemed to know everything within 24 hours. It was an ordinary Friday morning in every direction, except that the man carrying the grocery bags had spent the past 5 days quietly dismantling a fraud that would have destroyed a company and its thousands of employees, had done it without a title or an office or a parking spot with his name on it, and was now heading into the machinery of becoming visible after a very long time in the background. Not entirely sure what that was going to look like, only sure that it needed to happen and that he was finally ready for it. The elevator opened. Mason held the door for Mrs. Callahan. He did not feel like a man who had won something. He felt like a man who had finished a very long piece of work and was standing in the moment between putting the tools down and understanding what the work had been for. That understanding, he suspected, was going to take a while. That was okay. He had time. The Meridian Capital acquisition closed on a Tuesday, 3 weeks and 4 days after the night Mason had been walked out of a ballroom in front of 500 people. It closed without ceremony, which was how these things actually happened when you stripped away the mythology of corporate deals. Not with champagne and handshakes in a glass-walled conference room, but with a series of digital signatures executed across 3 time zones, and a final confirmation email that landed in Olivia's inbox at 2:17 in the afternoon while she was eating a sandwich at her desk and reviewing the draft of the public statement her communications team had prepared. She read the confirmation email twice. Then she set down the sandwich and sat quietly for a moment in a way that her assistant, passing by the open office door, noticed, and then quietly moved past without interrupting, because some moments had a quality that announced themselves even to people who weren't part of them. Mason learned about the closing from Claire Voss, who called him at 2:34 with the professional warmth of an attorney delivering good news she'd worked hard to make possible. "It's done," Claire said. "The equity disclosure processed cleanly. Your position is formally recognized in the closing documents. Meridian's legal team flagged it as irregular, but the authenticated shareholder agreement held up exactly as written." "I know," Mason said. "You don't seem particularly celebratory." "I'm glad it's done," Mason said. "That's different from celebratory." Claire was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone who had known a client long enough to understand the distinction they were making.
There will be a formal recognition process. The board wants to do something public. Olivia's communications team has been asking my office about your preferences for the announcement. Tell them minimal, Mason said. Accurate, but minimal. Mason, you own 60% of a company that just closed a $7 billion acquisition. Minimal may not be entirely in your control anymore. Tell them anyway, he said. They can negotiate from there. He hung up and looked out the window of his apartment at the street below. The same street it had always been, the dog walker and the delivery trucks, and the ordinary Wednesday life of a neighborhood that had no idea anything had changed. The numbers in his equity position had become, with the closing, something that Claire had described to him in concrete terms that his brain kept sliding off of. The way your eye slides off a number so large it stops reading as a number and starts reading as a concept. He didn't feel like a different person. He'd thought he might at the end of it all, but he didn't. He felt like the same person who'd eaten a peanut butter sandwich alone at his desk a week ago while cross-referencing server timestamps. He felt tired in a good way, the specific tiredness of someone who'd carried something heavy for a long time and had recently set it down, and whose body was still calibrating to the new weight of not carrying it. He was sitting at his desk when Evan came home from school. Evan came through the door with his backpack and the expression of someone who had been waiting all day for a specific piece of information. He stood in the entryway looking at his father. "Did it work out?" he asked. "It worked out," Mason said. Evan dropped his backpack, walked across the living room, and sat down on the couch with the controlled relief of someone who had been managing low-grade anxiety for 3 weeks and had just been given permission to stop. "Okay," he said. "Good." "Good," Mason agreed. They stayed like that for a moment. Father at the desk, son on the couch, the apartment settling around them in its familiar way. Then Evan said, "Can I get a dog now?" Mason looked at him. "What?" "You said when things calmed down we could talk about it." "I said we could think about it." "That's basically the same thing. It really isn't." "Dad." Evan pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. He'd been carrying it, Mason realized, which meant he'd prepared for this conversation, which meant he'd been planning it for more than one day, and unfolded it on the coffee table. It was a hand-drawn chart, columns with headings, reasons for and reasons against, and in a third column that showed a certain creative latitude with the assignment parameters, why the against reasons are wrong. Mason looked at the chart for a long moment. "You made a chart," he said. "I made a very good chart," Evan said. Mason leaned forward and read it. The handwriting was Evan's, slightly uneven, letter spacing that suggested enthusiasm over precision, several words whose spelling had been abandoned midway through and corrected with crossings out. The reasons for column had 11 items. The reasons against column had 4 items, all of which were addressed, with varying degrees of logical success, in the third column. "Dogs teach responsibility," Mason read aloud. "That's important for children," Evan said gravely. "Dogs are good for mental health." "I read that somewhere. Dogs can sense danger. That's a real thing, Dad. They can." Mason put the chart down. He looked at his son. The focused earnestness, the chart that had clearly taken an hour to produce, the jacket pocket it had been living in for what was probably several days. The 8-year-old who had made a chart and carried it, quietly, waiting for the right moment, because he'd learned somewhere, from some example, some pattern of behavior in his daily life, that patient preparation was more effective than impulsive demand. Something about that lodged itself somewhere in Mason's chest. "We'll talk about it seriously this weekend," Mason said. Evan's expression broke into the unguarded smile of a kid who knew the difference between no and "we'll talk about it seriously," and understood that this was firmly in the second category. He folded the chart with great care and put it back in his pocket. "Okay," he said. "Can I have a snack?" "Can you reach the crackers without moving the good mugs?" "Probably." "Then yes." The public announcement of Mason's ownership stake ran on a Friday. Olivia's communications team had, per Claire's negotiation, kept it accurate and relatively minimal. A single company statement that outlined the founding history, the structured equity arrangement, and the role Mason had played in recovering the company's architecture ahead of the acquisition closing. It named Victor Langley in the context of the ongoing federal investigation, without elaborating in ways that Claire had advised against for legal reasons. It did not describe Mason as a hero. Olivia had pushed for something warmer, and Mason had specifically asked her not to, and she'd respected that, though he could tell from the way she'd said fine on the phone that she didn't fully understand it. He understood it, though. There was a version of this story where he was the hero of it, and it was a comfortable version, the kind that resolved cleanly with the right person vindicated and the wrong person punished, and everyone able to feel that the arc of the narrative had bent in the correct direction. Mason had nothing against that version. He just knew it wasn't the accurate one. The accurate version was messier. In the accurate version, Mason had spent 3 years watching a company he'd built develop structural problems that he'd seen coming and hadn't intervened on because he was conducting a long experiment in whether institutions could self-correct. They couldn't, it turned out. Or at least this one hadn't, not without a crisis forcing the issue. Victor Langley had operated in plain sight for years, accumulating authority and access in ways that a present founder might have caught earlier. Mason's absence had created the space that the wrong person had filled. That was not comfortable to sit with. He sat with it anyway, because the alternative, the version where he was purely the wronged party and everyone else was purely at fault, required a level of simplification that he didn't think he'd earned the right to. He thought about this on the Saturday morning 2 days after the announcement, while sitting across from Olivia Carter in a coffee shop 3 blocks from his apartment. She had called Thursday evening and asked if they could meet, not at the office, just somewhere. He'd said yes, and suggested the coffee shop because it was near the apartment and had decent coffee and tables that were far enough apart that you could have a real conversation without managing what the adjacent tables were hearing. She was already there when he arrived, which surprised him slightly. He was a few minutes early, and she'd beaten him by what looked like at least 10 minutes, based on the state of her coffee cup. She was wearing clothes that were not work clothes, which was slightly disorienting because he'd only ever seen her in professional context, and it turned out that Olivia Carter in a regular sweater on a Saturday was both entirely the same person and somehow more legible. "I keep thinking about something," she said, before he'd fully settled into the chair. She had the habit, he'd noticed, of beginning conversations at whatever point in the thought she'd already reached, assuming the other person could catch up. He didn't mind it. "Okay," he said. "When I came to your apartment, that first night, you asked me who handed me the evidence, and I said, Victor." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "But what I've been thinking about since then is that the real answer is that I handed myself the evidence. Victor gave it to me, and I handed it to myself as fact, without doing any of the work that would have made it actually reliable." Mason looked at her. "I've been a CEO for 3 years," she said. "I've managed hundreds of people and dozens of major decisions. I knew that you verify before you act. I know that. I teach it. I say it in meetings." She paused. And then Victor Langley stood next to me with a very confident voice and a summary of information that confirmed a story I was already primed to believe about. About what kind of person you were, I guess. About what someone in your position would do. She stopped again. "I judged you by what you looked like, by what you drove, by the fact that you'd been in my building for 3 years and I'd never bothered to know who you were." The coffee shop was doing its Saturday morning business around them. A couple with a stroller, 2 women having a conversation that had clearly been continuing for years. A teenager in headphones who had been at the window table when Olivia arrived and hadn't looked up since. "You had no reason to know who I was," Mason said. "I made sure of that." "That's not the same as it being okay that I didn't try," Olivia said. "You made yourself invisible. I made you invisible. Those are different things." He considered that. "You're right," he said. "They are different." She looked at him. "Does it bother you? What happened at the gala?" He thought about the honest answer to that, which was a more complicated answer than the gracious one. "The public part was uncomfortable," he said. "I don't love being looked at by 500 people while a security guard has my arm. But the thing that bothered me was the part that came before it, standing there watching Victor perform that certainty, knowing exactly what he was doing, and understanding that the room was going to go along with it." He paused. "It's not that I was surprised. I find it hard to watch people be confident about wrong things. I've always found that hard." "Is that why you built the backup first?" "I built the backup because I knew someone was in the system and I didn't know who. The backup was practical." He drank his coffee. "But yeah, Partly I built it because I've learned not to trust that the right thing will be obvious to people in the moment. Sometimes the right thing only becomes obvious in retrospect, when the evidence is undeniable. So I built the evidence. Olivia nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment, turning her cup between her hands. Victor's attorney reached out to my legal team yesterday, she said. He's cooperating with the federal investigation. Claire probably told you. She told me. He gave them Aaron Systems' full operating structure, the contacts at the competing bidder, the data transfer records, all of it. She paused. His attorney is arguing for mitigation based on the cooperation. He'll probably serve less time than the crime warrants. Probably, Mason agreed. Does that bother you? Less than you'd think, Mason said. I'm not particularly invested in what happens to Victor. I'm invested in what the company looks like going forward, and in the investigation establishing a clear public record of what he did. The sentence is someone else's problem. Olivia looked at him with an expression that was halfway between admiration and confusion, the look of someone encountering a reaction they couldn't quite map onto their own emotional architecture. I would be furious, she said. I am furious, and he didn't even specifically target me. He did target you, Mason said. He controlled what you knew about the company you were running. He chose you partly because he believed he could manage your confidence. Feed you information you'd accept without questioning, build a relationship where you relied on his version of things. He looked at her. He was wrong about you, in the end. But that was his intention. She was quiet for a long moment. How do you know that? Because the evidence for the credential forgery was too clean, Mason said. Victor is meticulous. He doesn't make evidence that's sloppy unless he's confident the person presenting it won't question it. He was confident you wouldn't question it because he'd spent 3 years making sure you didn't need to question things he told you. Something moved across Olivia's face, a flash of something raw, and then the controlled surface settling back over it. That's a hard thing to hear, she said. I know. But you're telling me anyway. You asked, Mason said. You're not someone who asks questions and wants comfortable answers. I figured that out about you. She looked at him. When? When you drove yourself to my apartment, he said. You could have sent someone. You drove yourself, at night, to a neighborhood you'd never had reason to visit, and you knocked on the door of a person you'd publicly humiliated, and you sat at his kitchen table and asked him what was actually going on. He paused. That's not a person who wants comfortable answers. The coffee shop continued its Saturday business around them, indifferent and warm. What happens now? Olivia said. With the company. With you. The board wants to formalize my role, Mason said. Margaret Elroy has been very specific about that. They want the founder visible and accountable, which is fair, actually. I've been invisible long enough that the argument for continuing it doesn't hold anymore. What does visible and accountable look like to you? I don't know yet, he said honestly. I'm not going to become a different person. I'm not going to start wearing suits and giving speeches. But the board needs a principal who understands the technical architecture, and the engineering team needs leadership that… He stopped. That what? That knows what the work actually is, he said. Victor didn't know what the work was. He knew how to talk about it, but he didn't understand it, and over time that gap becomes the thing people exploit. The people who do understand it end up undervalued, and the people who can perform understanding end up with authority they haven't earned. He thought of Daniel Park, who had been a 27-year-old systems engineer passed over for promotion by the man who'd been stealing from the company. I want to fix that. Olivia nodded. Daniel Park is getting promoted, she said. I want you to know that. That's already done. Good. He asked for a specific title. He wanted Senior Systems Architect. I told him to pick whatever he wanted. He thought about it for a whole day. She smiled, a real one, slightly crooked, the kind that arrived without being curated. He came back and said he wanted Senior Systems Architect because it was accurate, and he didn't believe in titles that were larger than the job. Mason looked at her. He's going to be valuable. I know, I should have seen it earlier. She met his eyes. I should have seen a lot of things earlier. It was the third time she'd said something like that, a variation on the theme of what she'd missed, what she'd failed to notice, what her own assumptions had cost her. Mason had let the first two pass because they were true, and she needed to say them and they didn't require a response. But the third time, he said something. Olivia. He used her name the way she'd used his that first morning, with the slight careful quality of crossing a threshold. You were 30 years old running a company that had been set up structurally to mislead you. You were given a leadership role by someone who wanted a capable person he could manage. You did the job well in the areas where you had real information. What you didn't do was interrogate the information itself. He paused. That's a lesson, not a character flaw. Most people don't learn it until they've paid for it once. She looked at him for a long moment. You're doing it again, she said. What? Making it easier. No, he said. I'm making it accurate. There's a difference. He picked up his coffee. The accurate version of you is a 30-year-old CEO who made a serious mistake based on manipulated information and then drove herself to the apartment of the person she'd wronged and asked what was actually going on. That's the accurate version. The rest is what you do with it. Something shifted in her expression. Not relief, because the thing he was describing wasn't a relief, but something like the specific gravity of a person who has been handed the actual weight of a thing instead of a version of it that's been adjusted for comfort. Thank you, she said, for that. Don't thank me, Mason said. Just don't do it again. She laughed, a short, genuine sound that surprised both of them slightly. I'll do my best, she said. The weeks that followed were complicated in the way that the aftermath of large events is always complicated, full of processes and paperwork and conversations that were necessary and unglamorous and entirely unlike the dramatic clarity of the crisis itself. Victor Langley was formally indicted on 4 federal counts, including wire fraud, corporate espionage, and securities manipulation. The indictment was 43 pages long and contained, in the dry language of federal legal documents, a detailed reconstruction of everything Mason had mapped on his whiteboard and in his archived notes over months of quiet observation. The Aaron system structure unraveled over the following weeks as cooperating witnesses provided names that led to other names, and the competing bidder who had been the intended beneficiary of the stolen architecture found themselves the subject of a separate investigation that their own legal team was not entirely surprised by. Mason followed the legal developments the way he followed most things, attentively, from a distance, without attaching his sense of resolution to their pace. Claire kept him updated at weekly intervals. He responded with specific questions and minimal commentary and let the process move at its own speed. The formal board restructuring took longer. Margaret Elroy ran it with the methodical patience of a woman who understood that structures created quickly were structures built on assumptions, and she convened 3 separate sessions before she was satisfied with the governance framework that would define Mason's role going forward. He attended all 3, answered questions, pushed back twice on specific provisions that he thought created the wrong incentives, and ultimately arrived at an arrangement that he described to Claire as workable, and that Claire described to him as remarkably equitable for someone with 60% equity. You could have structured this with considerably more control, Claire said, during their final review session. I know, Mason said. You're choosing accountability over control. I'm choosing a board structure that will survive being wrong about things, Mason said. Control is what Victor had. Look how that worked. Claire made a note. I'm going to quote you in the documentation. Don't, Mason said. Just write it in plain language. Daniel Park's promotion processed on a Thursday in mid-April, and he sent Mason a text that said, just got the official letter. Senior Systems Architect, thank you for what you did. Mason texted back, you did the thing that mattered. I just set up the conditions. Daniel replied, that's basically what being a founder is, right? Mason looked at that for a while before he answered, more or less. Welcome to understanding that. The Novaris Technologies public profile recovered faster than the analysts had predicted, which Mason gathered from the coverage his communications team forwarded to him, and which he read with the detached attention of someone tracking a variable in a system he'd built. Investors who had wavered during the acquisition suspension returned with what the financial press called renewed confidence, and what Mason privately understood as the collective decision of people who calculate risk to decide that the risk had been repriced in their favor. The acquisition deal's closing, the criminal indictment of the COO, the revelation of the founding equity structure. All of it was absorbed by the market with the pragmatic resilience that markets display toward good underlying fundamentals dressed in bad recent history. The company was stronger, as these things sometimes went, for having nearly broken. Mason was not romantic about that. He didn't believe that institutions needed to nearly fail in order to learn what they were made of. He believed that most of what the crisis had revealed could have been revealed earlier, through better structures and better attention, and that the lesson wasn't that you needed the fire to know what survived it. The lesson was that you built things that didn't need the fire, that you paid attention before the emergency, that you put the right people in the right rooms and gave them the right authority, and didn't let the people who were good at performing competence accumulate power over the people who were good at actual competence. He was still working out what that looked like in practice. He expected he would be working it out for years. That was fine. He had years. On a Saturday in late April, 4 weeks after the acquisition closed and 6 weeks after the night of the gala, Mason drove to the animal shelter on the east side of the city with Evan in the passenger seat and Evan's chart, slightly worn from repeated handling, folded in Evan's jacket pocket for reasons that were entirely ceremonial at this point, since the decision had been made, but which Evan apparently felt were important to bring along anyway. The shelter smelled like disinfectant and dog, and the specific quality of animal noise that existed in that particular register between need and hope. Evan walked through it with his hands clasped behind his back in the unconscious imitation of his father's habitual posture, looking at each kennel with the focused seriousness of someone conducting a consequential evaluation. There were a lot of dogs. Evan took 23 minutes, which Mason tracked with the patient attention of a man who had learned that some processes could not be rushed, and that this one, specifically, was one of his son's first real decisions of consequence, and required the time it required. He stopped in front of a medium-sized dog of indeterminate heritage, brown and white, ears that hadn't committed to a shape, an expression of complete focused attention, trained on Evan with the intensity of an animal who has learned to read human intention and had decided something about this particular human. "This one," Evan said. "Tell me why," Mason said, because he always asked Evan to explain his reasoning, not because he intended to argue with it, but because he believed that the habit of articulating why you chose something was worth developing early. Evan thought about it. "He's not the loudest or the most," he searched for the word, "the most anything. He's just paying attention." He looked at Mason. "He's like you." Mason looked at the dog. The dog looked back at him with a calm, assessing patience that was, Mason admitted privately, somewhat familiar. "All right," Mason said. The dog's shelter name was a number. They renamed him in the car on the way home, after a deliberation that lasted until the second traffic light, when Evan announced the name with the confidence of someone who had been thinking about it longer than the drive suggested. "Franklin," Evan said. "Franklin," Mason repeated. "It's a good name," Evan said. "It's serious, but not boring." Mason looked at the road ahead. Franklin was in the back seat in a borrowed carrier, looking out through the mesh door with the equanimity of an animal in unfamiliar circumstances who had decided, based on available evidence, that things were probably going to be okay. "Serious but not boring," Mason said. "I can work with that." Olivia came to the apartment for the second time on a Sunday evening in early May, 3 weeks after their coffee shop conversation, and this visit was different from the first two in ways that both of them understood without discussing directly. She brought food, takeout from a place she'd asked Mason about in a text that morning, a question that was also, understood correctly, something more than a question about food. He'd given her the name of the place, and she'd shown up at 6:30 with enough for 3 people, which was exactly right, because there were 3 people. Evan greeted her at the door with the directness he applied to most social situations. "We got a dog," he said. "His name is Franklin. He's in the kitchen, but he's not supposed to be on the furniture yet because Dad says we have to establish boundaries first." "That sounds like good thinking," Olivia said. "I think he's already on the couch," Evan said. "I heard that," Mason said from the kitchen. Franklin was, in fact, on the couch. He removed himself with an expression of complete innocence when Mason appeared in the doorway, walked to his bed in the corner, turned around twice, and lay down with the dignity of an animal who had been in that bed all along. Evan looked at Olivia. "He does that every time," he said, with the tone of someone reporting on a recurring institutional behavior. Olivia looked at Franklin. She looked at Evan. Something moved across her face that was warm and unguarded and slightly surprised by itself. "He sounds like someone else I know," she said. Mason, who had heard this, said nothing and went to set out plates. Dinner was not a formal thing. It was takeout containers on the kitchen table and Evan talking about his class's spring project, and Franklin appearing periodically at the edge of the kitchen, looking hopeful in the particular way of dogs who have identified which humans are most likely to drop food, and Olivia asking Evan questions with the careful, genuine curiosity of someone who was not performing interest in a child, but was actually interested. At one point, Evan described, with great detail and mild outrage, the injustice of the kickball dispute that had been occupying the class's social ecosystem for the better part of 2 weeks. Olivia listened to the full account, asked 2 clarifying questions, and then said, "The problem is that the rules weren't agreed on before the game started. If everyone agrees on the rules first, you remove the argument." Evan looked at her with sudden intense focus. "That's actually what I said," he told her. "I said that and nobody listened." People often don't listen to the right answer when it comes from the person who doesn't seem like they should have the right answer, Olivia said. Evan processed this. "Because I'm a kid? In your case, yes. In other cases," she glanced at Mason for a fraction of a second. "Other things." Evan looked between them with the particular sensitivity of a child who has learned to read rooms. Then he looked back at Olivia with an expression that was evaluating something and seemed to reach a conclusion. "You can come back," he said, not unkindly, with the matter-of-fact tone of a child issuing a genuine judgment that he considered meaningful. Olivia blinked. "Thank you," she said. "I'd like that." After dinner, Evan did homework at the table, and Franklin relocated from the corner of the kitchen to a position strategically adjacent to Evan's chair, and Mason and Olivia stood in the kitchen with the dishes and had the kind of conversation that is made up of ordinary logistics and is actually about something else entirely. She was not the right answer to everything. He knew that. She was a 30-year-old CEO who was still learning what kind of leader she wanted to be, who had made a serious error in judgment 6 weeks ago and was living with the process of correcting it without either minimizing it or letting it define her. She was someone who drove herself to hard conversations instead of sending someone else. She was someone who asked real questions and waited for real answers. He was not the right answer to everything either. He knew that too. He was a 32-year-old single father who had spent 3 years making himself invisible because invisibility had felt safer than the alternative, and who was now in the process of becoming visible in ways he hadn't fully worked out yet. He had a dog he didn't know how to train, and a company he was renegotiating his relationship with, and a son who had produced a chart and carried it in his pocket for days because he'd learned from somewhere that preparation and patience were worth more than impulse. He looked at Evan at the table, bent over his homework with Franklin's head resting on his foot. He thought about the drawing on the refrigerator, the house with 3 figures, the one Evan had been adding to that day in part 2, when everything was still unresolved and the shape of what came next was not yet visible. The drawing had been made in anticipation of something Evan couldn't have articulated but had felt, the way children feel the shape of approaching change before they have language for it. The drawing was still on the refrigerator. 3 figures, a house, a yellow sun in the corner because it was a sun, and suns needed to be in the picture. It was not a perfect picture. The proportions were off, the figures were blocky, the house was the architectural aspiration of an 8-year-old rather than anything structurally sound. But it was true, in the way that things made without self-consciousness were often true. A direct line from the inside of the person who made it to the paper, without the editing that adults applied and applied, until sometimes the true thing disappeared entirely under the corrections. Mason believed in true things. He'd spent a significant portion of his adult life building systems designed to preserve true things in environments that would otherwise alter them, and what the last 6 weeks had confirmed for him, if he'd needed confirmation, was that this wasn't just a professional habit. It was a way of moving through the world, a belief that the original thing, the authentic version, was worth the considerable trouble of protecting. The original architecture had survived because he'd backed it up before anyone could replace it, because he'd paid attention to the anomalies before the crisis, because he'd been patient enough to let the evidence build into something undeniable instead of reacting to the first injury. That was not a lesson exclusive to server architecture. Olivia was looking at the drawing on the refrigerator. "He made that a few weeks ago," Mason said, coming to stand beside her. "During everything that was happening?" "During everything," Mason said. "I don't know if he knew what he was making. I think he just felt like it should have 3 people in it." Olivia looked at the drawing for a long moment. She had her arms crossed in the self-contained posture of someone who was feeling something and was used to managing their feelings before showing them. But she wasn't quite managing this one, or wasn't trying to, and it showed in the particular softness around her expression that she usually kept precisely controlled. "He's a remarkable kid," she said quietly. "I know," Mason said. "I can't take full credit. He got there mostly on his own." "That's not how it works," Olivia said. "The people around you shape what you become, even when you don't know it's happening." She said it simply, without weight, as a statement of something she believed rather than an observation aimed at him. But it landed where it landed, and he let it. He reached up and straightened the drawing on the refrigerator, which had developed a slight lean over the past weeks, pressed the corner back flat, stepped back. The house was still slightly crooked. The sun was still in the corner. The three figures were still there, standing side by side in front of something that was still being built, imperfect and unfinished, and for that reason, exactly right. "You want coffee?" Mason asked. "Yeah," Olivia said, "I do." I made it, and they drank it, and Evan fell asleep at the table over his homework with Franklin's head still on his foot, and Mason carried him to bed the way he'd been carrying him since he was 2 years old, carefully, with the specific attentiveness of someone who understood they were holding something irreplaceable. And when he came back to the kitchen, Olivia was washing the takeout containers with the unself-conscious practicality of someone who had decided to be useful rather than decorative. He dried. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, moving and humming, and being entirely indifferent to the specific human configurations taking place within it. The street had the same delivery trucks and the same dog walkers, and the same ordinary texture of a neighborhood that had no idea what had happened in the weeks just past, or what was quietly, carefully beginning now. Inside the apartment, a man who had spent 3 years being invisible was standing in his kitchen with a dish towel and a woman who was still learning how to ask the right questions. In the next room, an 8-year-old slept with a dog who had learned already in 4 weeks to position himself as close to Evan as the laws of physics and domestic furniture would allow. On the refrigerator, a drawing of a house with 3 figures in front of it. No one in that apartment was without their complications. No one had emerged from the past 6 weeks without something they were still processing, something that would take more time than they yet knew. The easy version of this story would say that everything had been set right and everyone had found what they were looking for, and the ending was clean. It wasn't clean. It was real, which was different. Messier and less resolved, and in several ways more uncertain than a clean ending. Victor Langley's trial would take years. Mason's new role at Novaris would require negotiation and adjustment that hadn't yet begun. Olivia had work to do on how she led, and Mason had work to do on how he allowed himself to be visible, and Evan had to negotiate the presence of Franklin with the furniture, which was an ongoing project. But here's what was true, and what remained true when you set aside the complications. A man who had built something real had protected it. A woman who had made a serious mistake had chosen the harder response of walking toward it rather than away from it. A child had drawn a house with 3 figures because he'd felt that that was the right number, and he'd been right, and the drawing was still on the refrigerator. The architecture was restored. The evidence had held. The truth, the original, unaltered version of what things actually were, had survived the attempt to replace it. That was enough. That was, in Mason Brooks's considered and quietly certain opinion, exactly enough.